Chapter 23. Although Dinu and Arjun had known each other a long time, they had never been friends. Dinu tended to think of Arjun on the analogy of a friendly and bumbling pet, a large dog perhaps, or a well-trained mule, a creature of unfailing, tail-wagging goodwill, but incurably indolent and barely capable of coherent utterance. But Dinu was not so arrogant as to be unwilling to correct himself. At Howrah station, on the day when he photographed Arjun running across the platform, he saw immediately that this was a significantly changed person from the boy he had known. Arjun had lost his somnolence, and his patterns of speech were no longer so garbled and indistinct as they had once been. This itself was an interesting paradox, for Arjun's vocabulary seemed now to consist mainly of jargon intermixed with assorted bits of English and Punjabi slang. Everyone was now either a chap or a yar, but on the way home from the station Arjun did something that astonished Dinu. In reminiscing about a tactical exercise, he launched into a description of a feature of topography, a hill. He listed its ridges and outcrops, the exact nature of its vegetation and the cover it afforded. He quoted the angle of the slope's incline and laughed about how his friend Hardy had got it wrong so that his results wouldn't play. Dinu understood words and images and the bridge of metaphor that linked the two. These were not languages with which he had ever thought to associate Arjun. Yet by the end of Arjun's description, Dinu felt that he could see the hill in his head. Of those who listened to Arjun's account, he alone was perhaps fully aware of the extreme difficulty of achieving such minuteness of recall and such vividness of description. He was awed both by the precision of Arjun's narrative and by the off-handed lack of self-consciousness with which it was presented. "Arjun," he said, fixing him with his dour, unblinking stare. "I'm amazed. You described that hill as though you'd remembered every little bit of it." "Of course," said Arjun. "My CO says that, under fire, you pay with a life for every missed detail." This too made Dinu take notice. He'd imagined that he knew the worth of observation, yet he'd never conceived that its value might be weighed in lives. There was something humbling about the thought of this. He'd regarded a soldier's training as being, in the first instance, physical, a matter of the body. It took just that one conversation to show him that he had been wrong. Dinu's friends were mainly writers and intellectuals. He had never met a serviceman in all his life. Now suddenly, in Calcutta, he found himself surrounded by soldiers. Within hours of his arrival, Arjun had filled the house with his friends. It turned out that he knew a couple of officers at the Fort William cantonment in Calcutta. Once he'd made contact, his friends began to turn up at all times of day, in jeeps and occasionally even in trucks, their arrival signaled by booming klaxons and noisy boots. "This is how it always happens in the army, yar," one of them said, by way of apologetic explanation. "Where one Fauji goes, the whole Pulton follows." In the past, Dinu's attitude towards the army had varied between outright hostility and amused indifference. Now he found himself more puzzled than antagonistic, increasingly interested in the mechanisms that made them tick. He was astonished by the communal nature of their lives. By the pleasure that Arjun, for instance, took in mucking in with the others. This was a way of thinking and working that was the antithesis of everything that Dinu stood for and believed in. He himself was always happiest when he was on his own. His friends were few, and even with the best of them there was always a residue of unease and analytic guardedness. This was one of the reasons why he derived so much pleasure from photography. There was no place more solitary than a dark room, with its murky light and fetid closeness. Arjun, on the other hand, seemed to find immense satisfaction in working on the details of plans that had been dictated by others, not necessarily people either, but manuals of procedure. Once, speaking of his battalion's move from one cantonment to another, he described their entrainment routines with as much pride as though he had personally guided every soldier into the station. But at the end it emerged that his part had consisted of nothing more than standing at the door of a carriage and filling in a roster. Dinu was astonished to note that it was precisely from this that his satisfaction derived, the slow accumulation of small tasks, a piling up of rosters that culminated in the movement of a platoon and then a battalion. Arjun was often at pains to explain that in the army, it was a vital necessity for the chaps to possess a thorough and exhaustive understanding of one another, to know exactly how each of them would respond in certain circumstances. Yet there was a paradox here that did not escape Dinu. When Arjun and his friends spoke of one another, their assessments were so exaggerated that they seemed to be inventing versions of themselves for collective consumption. In the fantastic bestiary of their table talk, Hardy was the speed and Polish perfectionist, Arjun a ladies' man, another a Pakka Sahib, and so on. These paper-thin portraits were a part of the collective lore of their camaraderie, a fellowship in which they took immense pride, investing it with metaphors that sometimes extended even beyond mere kinship. Usually they were just brothers, but at times they were also much more, even the first true Indians. Look at us, they would say, Punjabis, Marathas, Bengalis, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims. Where else in India would you come across a group such as ours, where region and religion don't matter, where we can all drink together and eat beef and pork and think nothing of it? Every meal at an officer's mess, Arjun said, was an adventure, a glorious infringement of taboos. They ate foods that none of them had ever touched at home: bacon, ham and sausages at breakfast, roast beef and pork chops for dinner. They drank whiskey, beer and wine, smoked cigars, cigarettes and cigarillos. Nor was this just a matter of satisfying appetites. Every mouthful had a meaning, each represented an advance towards the evolution of a new, more complete kind of Indian. All of them had stories to tell about how their stomachs had turned the first time they had chewed upon a piece of beef or pork. They had struggled to keep the morsels down, fighting their revulsion. Yet they had persisted, for these were small but essential battles, and they tested not just their manhood, but also their fitness to enter the class of officers. They had to prove, to themselves as well as to their superiors, that they were eligible to be rulers, to qualify as members of an elite, that they had vision enough to rise above the ties of their soil, to overcome the responses instilled in them by their upbringing. Look at us, Arjun would say after a whiskey or two, we are the first modern Indians, the first Indians to be truly free. We eat what we like, we drink what we like, we are the first Indians who are not weighed down by the past. To Dinu this was profoundly offensive. It's not what you eat and drink that makes you modern, it's a way of looking at things. Quote. He'd fetch reproductions that he'd cut out of magazines, of photographs by Stieglitz, Cunningham and Weston. Arjun would shrug these off with a laughing retort, to you the modern world is just something you read about. What you know of it you get from books and newspapers. We are the ones who actually live with Westerners. Dinu understood that it was through their association with Europeans that Arjun and his fellow officers saw themselves as pioneers. They knew that to most of their compatriots the West was a distant abstraction. Even though they might know themselves to be ruled by England, very few Indians had ever actually set eyes on an Englishman, and fewer still had had occasion to speak to one. The English lived in their own enclaves and followed their own pursuits. Most of the day-to-day tasks of ruling were performed by Indians. In the army, on the other hand, Indian officers were a band of the elect. They lived in a proximity with Westerners that was all but unknown to their compatriots. They shared the same quarters, ate the same food, did the same work. In this, their situation was unlike that of any of the empire's other subjects. We understand the West better than any of your civilians, Arjun liked to say. We know how the minds of Westerners work. Only when every Indian is like us will the country become truly modern. Meals with Arjun's friends were boisterous events, accompanied by lashings of beer, loud laughter and a great deal of acerbic joke-making. Mainly by the officers, at each other's expense. This they described as ragging, and most of it was good-natured. But there was an occasion once when the flow of the meal was ruptured by an odd little incident. Seeing a dish of hot, steam-puffed chapatis, one of the officers said in a loud, derisory, ragging voice, Hardy should have been here, he's the one who really loves chapatis. Quote. These words, apparently innocuous, had a startling effect. The noise died abruptly and the officers' faces turned suddenly grave. The lieutenant who'd spoken changed color, as though in acknowledgement of a collective rebuke. Then, as if to remind his friends of the presence of outsiders, Dinu, Manju and Neil, in other words, Arjun loudly cleared his throat and the conversation turned instantly to another subject. The interruption lasted no longer than a moment and passed unnoticed by everyone but Dinu. Later that night, Dinu stopped by Arjun's room and found him sitting in bed with a book against his knees and a brandy in his hand. Dinu lingered. You want to tackle me, don't you? Arjun said. About what happened this evening? Yes, it was nothing, really, all the more reason to tell me. Arjun sighed. It was about a good friend of mine, Hardy. Odd to think he wasn't even here. What were they talking about? It's a long story. You see, Hardy was in a row last year. It'll sound idiotic to you. What happened? Are you sure you want to know? Yes, Hardy's a Sardar, Arjun said, a Sikh, from a family that's been in the army for generations. You'd be surprised how many of the chaps are from that kind of family. I call them the real Fauji's. Fellows like me, who have no army connections, are the exception. Hardy had grown up at the battalion's depot in Saharanpur, Arjun said. His father and grandfather had both served in the 1st Jats. They had joined as private soldiers and worked their way up to the rank of Viceroy's commissioned officer, which was the highest an Indian could rise in those days, somewhere between an NCO and an officer. Hardy was the first in his family to join the army as a commissioned officer, and he'd set his heart on getting into the 1/1 Jats. He used to joke that his dream was to be called Sahib by his father's old colleagues. But between the lives of officers and the other ranks there was a difference that Hardy had not reckoned with. The other ranks were served Indian food in their messes, prepared according to the precise dietary prescriptions of their various religions. The officers' mess, on the other hand, served English food, and the trouble with Hardy was that he was one of those chaps who, no matter how hard they tried, simply could not get by without his daily dal roti. He dutifully ate whatever was served in the mess, but at least once a day, he'd find a pretext to leave the cantonment so that he could eat his fill somewhere in town. This was a commonplace enough occurrence among Indian officers, but Hardy crossed an unseen line. He started visiting the other ranks' messes. He enjoyed these little visits. He called some of the men uncle as a child, and he assumed that they would afford him the same indulgence and affection that he remembered from the past. They would keep his visits a secret, he thought. After all, many of them were from the same village, the same extended family. Many had known his father. It turned out that he could not have been more wrong. Far from being pleased at serving under Hardy, his father's old colleagues were deeply offended by his presence in the battalion. They were of the first generation of Indian soldiers to serve under Indian officers. Many of them were uneasy about this. Their relationship with their British officers was the source of their pride and prestige. To serve under Indians was a dilution of this privilege. A day came when the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bucky Buckland, recommended that Hardy be given command of C Company. So far as the company's NCOs were concerned, this was the last straw. Some of them knew Lieutenant Colonel Buckland well. They had served with him for many years, and it was part of their job to keep him informed about the happenings in the unit. They formed a delegation and went to see him. They told him, "This boy, Hardayal Singh, to whom you've given charge of C Company, his father is known to us. His sisters are married to our brothers, his home is in the village next to ours. How can you expect us to treat this boy as an officer? Why, he cannot even stomach the food that officers eat. He steals secretly into our messes to eat chapatis." Lieutenant Colonel Buckland was deeply disturbed by these complaints. It was impossible not to be repelled by the murkiness of these sentiments. If there was an implicit self-hatred in trusting only your own, then how much deeper was the self-loathing that led a group of men to distrust someone for no reason other than that he was one of them? Lieutenant Colonel Buckland gave the NCOs a sharp reprimand. "You are living in the past. The time has come when you will have to learn to take orders from Indians. This man is the son of your former colleague. Do you really want to shame him in public?" The NCOs held fast despite this berating. In the end, it was the lieutenant colonel who had to yield. There had always been an unspoken compact between the men and their English officers. On certain matters it was understood that their wishes had to be taken into account. The lieutenant colonel was left with no choice but to send for Hardy, to tell him that his appointment couldn't go through just yet. This proved to be the most difficult part of the whole affair. How were the charges to be explained to Hardy? How does a soldier defend himself against the accusation of being, as it were, a covert chapati eater? What does this do to his self-respect? Lieutenant Colonel Buckland dealt with the situation as tactfully as anyone could have, and Hardy emerged from the interview without showing any visible signs of discomfiture. Only his closest friends knew how deeply he'd been wounded, how hard it had been for him to face those NCOs the next day. And, of course, the army being a small, tight institution, word always got around, and from time to time even friends would say the wrong thing, just as they had that night. "Do all of you face this, then?" Dinu asked Arjun. "Is it hard for you to be accepted as officers by your own men?" "Yes and no," Arjun replied. You always have the feeling that they're looking at you more closely than they would if you were a Britisher, especially me, I suppose, since I'm just about the only Bengali inside. But you also have a sense that they're identifying with you, that some of them are urging you on, while others are just waiting to see you fall. When I'm facing them, I can tell that they're putting themselves in my place, crossing a barrier that has become a great divide in their minds. The moment they imagine themselves past that line, something changes. It can't be as it was before. What do you mean? I'm not sure I can explain, Dinu. I'll tell you a story. Once, an old English colonel visited our mess. He was full of tales about the good old days. After dinner I happened to hear him talking to Bucky, our company. He was huffing and puffing and blowing through his whiskers. His view was that this business of making officers out of Indians would destroy the army. Everyone would be at each other's throats and the whole thing would fall apart. Now, Bucky's just about as fair and decent as a man can be, and he wasn't going to put up with this. He defended us stoutly and said his Indian officers were doing a very good job and all the rest of it. But you know, the thing of it was that in my heart I knew that Bucky was wrong and the old codger was right. Why, it's simple. Every institution has its own logic, and the British Indian Army has always functioned on the understanding that there was to be a separation between Indians and Britishers. It was a straightforward system. They stayed apart, and obviously both sides felt that this was to their benefit. It's no easy thing, you know, to make men fight. The Britishers found a way of doing it, and they made it work. But now, with us being inside the officers' mess, I don't know that it can go on. Why not? Arjun got up to pour himself another brandy. Because it's true what the old codger said, we're at each other's throats. Who? Indians and Britishers, really? Why? What about? Most of it is just little things. In the mess, for instance, if a Britisher turns the radio to a broadcast in English, you can be sure that minutes later an Indian will tune it to Hindi film songs. And then someone will turn it back and so on, until all you can do is hope that it gets switched off altogether. Things like that. You sound like squabbling schoolchildren. Yes, but there's something important behind it, I think. What? You see, we all do the same work, eat the same food and so on. But the chaps who are trained in England get paid a lot more than we do. For myself I don't mind so much, but chaps like Hardy care very much about these things. To them this is not just a job as it is for me. You see, they really believe in what they're doing. They believe that the British stand for freedom and equality. Most of us, when we hear big words like that, tend to take them with a pinch of salt. They don't. They're deadly serious about these things, and that's why it's so hard for them when they discover that this equality they've been told about is a carrot on a stick, something that's dangled in front of their noses to keep them going but always kept just out of reach. Why don't they complain? They do sometimes. But usually there's nothing in particular to complain about. Take the case of Hardy's appointment. Who was to blame? Hardy himself. The men. It certainly wasn't the company. But that's how it always is. Whenever one of us doesn't get an appointment or a promotion, there's always a mist of regulations that makes things unclear. On the surface everything in the army appears to be ruled by manuals, regulations, procedures. It seems very cut and dried. But actually, underneath there are all these murky shadows that you can never quite see: prejudice, distrust, suspicion. Arjun tossed his brandy back and paused to pour himself another. I'll tell you something, he said, something that happened to me while I was at the academy. One day a group of us went into town, Hardy, me, a few others. It started to rain and we stepped into a shop. The shopkeeper offered to lend us umbrellas. Without thinking about it I said, yes, of course. That'll be a help. The others looked at me as though I'd gone mad. What are you thinking of? Hardy said to me. You can't be seen with an umbrella. I was puzzled. I said, but why not? Why can't I be seen with an umbrella? Hardy's answer was, have you ever seen an Indian soldier using an umbrella? I thought about it and realized I hadn't. I said, no. Do you know why not? No, because in the old days in the East, umbrellas were a sign of sovereignty. The British didn't want their sepoys to get over ambitious. That's why you'll never see umbrellas at a cantonment. I was amazed. Could this possibly be true? I felt sure there were no regulations on the subject. Can you imagine a rule that said, Indians are not to keep umbrellas in their barracks? It's inconceivable. But at the same time, it was also true that you never saw anyone with an umbrella at a cantonment. One day I asked the adjutant, Captain Pearson. I said, "Sir, why do we never use umbrellas, even when it rains?" Captain Pearson is a short, tough, bull-necked fellow. He looked at me as though I were a worm. Nothing could have shut me up quicker than the answer he gave me. He said, "We don't use umbrellas, Lieutenant, because we're not women." Arjun began to laugh. "And now," he said, "I would rather do anything than be seen with an umbrella. I'd rather drown in the rain." Chapter 24. That year it seemed as though the monsoons had broken over Lankasuka well before the first clouds had appeared in the skies. Manju's wedding was in late June, just before the coming of the rains. The days were very hot, and in the park in front of the house, the lake fell to a level where boats could no longer be taken out on the water. It was the time of year when even the rotation of the earth seemed to slacken in speed, in anticipation of the coming deluge. But within Lankasuka the wedding created the semblance of a strange climatic anomaly. It was as though the compound were awash in a flood. Its inhabitants swirling hectically downriver, carried along by great tides of disparate things, people, gifts, anxiety, laughter, food. In the courtyard at the back, cooking fires burnt all day long, and on the roof, under the bright tented awnings that had been erected for the wedding, there seemed never to be a moment when several dozen people were not sitting down to a meal. The days went by in a storm of feasting and observances. The solemn familial commitments of the Paka Dekha led inexorably to the yellowed turmeric anointing of the Gaye Holud. Slowly, much as the rising water of the monsoons overwhelms the checkerboard partitions of a paddy field, so did the steady progression of the wedding sweep away the embankments that divided the lives of the people in the house. Uma's white-sarried political associates pitched in to help, as did a great many khaki-clad Congress workers. Arjun's friends at Fort William sent auxiliary detachments of cooks, mess boys, waiters, and even, on occasion, entire marching bands complete with wrap-around brass and uniformed bandmasters. Much of Manju's college came pouring in, and so did a colorful throng of Neil's acquaintances from the film studios of Toliganj, directors, actors, students, playback singers, even the two terrifying makeup women who had dressed Manju on the day of her fateful audition. Dolly too had a hand in stirring the mix. Through her years of visiting Uma in Calcutta, she had developed a close connection with the city's Burmese temple. Small though this temple was, its past was not without luster. Many great Burmese luminaries had spent time there, including the famous activist monk U Visera. By way of Dolly's links, Manju's wedding came to be attended by a substantial part of the city's Burmese community, students, monks, lawyers, and even a few hulking sergeants of Calcutta's police force, many of whom were Anglo-Burmese in origin. Considering how oddly assorted these groups were, disagreements were relatively few. But in the end it proved impossible to shut out the powerful winds that were sweeping the world. On one occasion a friend of Uma's, an eminent congressman, arrived dressed in the manner of Jawaharlal Nehru, in a khaki cap and a long black sherwani, with a rose in his buttonhole. The elegant politician found himself standing next to a friend of Arjun's, a lieutenant dressed in the uniform of the 14th Punjab Regiment. "And how does it feel?" the politician said, turning to the soldier with a sneer, "for an Indian to be wearing that uniform?" "If you must know, sir," Arjun's friend snapped back, matching sneer for sneer, "this uniform feels rather warm, but I imagine the same could be said of yours." Another day, Arjun found himself facing off against a strangely assorted crowd of Buddhist monks, Burmese student activists, and Congress party workers. The congressman had bitter memories of their confrontations with Indian soldiers and policemen. They began to berate Arjun for serving in an army of occupation. Arjun recalled that it was his sister's wedding and he managed to keep his temper. "We aren't occupying the country," Arjun said, as lightly as he could. "We are here to defend you." "From whom are you defending us?" "From ourselves. From other Indians. It's your masters from whom the country needs to be defended." "Look," said Arjun, "it's a job and I'm trying to do it as best I can." One of the Burmese students gave him a grim smile. "Do you know what we say in Burma when we see Indian soldiers? We say, 'There goes the army of slaves, marching off to catch some more slaves for their masters.'" It was with a great effort that Arjun succeeded in keeping control of himself. Instead of getting into a fight, he turned round and marched away. Later, he went to complain to Uma and found her wholly unsympathetic. "They were just telling you what most people in the country think, Arjun," Uma said bluntly. "If you're strong enough to face enemy bullets, you should be strong enough to hear them out." For the duration of his stay in Lankasuka, Kishan Singh had been allotted a small room that was tucked away at the rear of the house. At other times this room was generally used for storage, mainly of food. Along the walls stood great stone martabans, packed with pickles. In the corners were piles of ripening mangoes and guavas, hanging from the rafters. Beyond the reach of ants and cats, were the rope-slung earthen pots in which the household's butter and ghee were stored. One afternoon, Bela was sent to the storeroom on an errand, to fetch some butter. The wooden door was slightly warped and could not be properly closed. Looking through the crack, Bela saw that Kishan Singh was inside, lying on a mat. He changed into a longi for his siesta, and his khakis were hanging on a peg. He was sweating in the June heat, bare-bodied but for the ghostly shadow of the army singlet that was singed onto his chest. From the pumping motion of his ribs, Bela could tell that he was fast asleep. She slipped into the room and tiptoed around his mat. She was on her knees, undoing the strings of the earthen butter pot, when Kishan Singh suddenly woke up. He jumped to his feet and pulled on his khaki tunic, his face turning red with embarrassment. "My mother sent me," she said quickly, "to fetch this." She pointed at the earthen pot. With his tunic on, he seated himself cross-legged on the mat. He gave her a smile. Bela smiled shyly back. She felt no inclination to leave. She hadn't spoken to him till then, and it occurred to her now that there were many things she wanted to ask him. The first question she blurted out was the one that was uppermost in her mind. "Kishan Singh," she said, "are you married?" "Yes," he said gravely. "And I have a little son. Just 1 year old. How old were you when you were married?" "It was 4 years ago," he said. "So I must have been 16. "And your wife," she said, "what is she like?" "She's from the village next to mine." "And where is your village?" "It's up north, a long way from here. It's near Kurukshetra, where the great battle of the Mahabharata was fought. That is why the men of our district make good soldiers, that's what people say." "And did you always want to be a soldier?" "No." He laughed. "Not at all, but I had no choice. The men in his family had always lived by soldiering," he explained. His father, his grandfather, his uncles, they had all served in the 1/1 Jats. His grandfather had died at Passchendaele in the Great War. The day before his death he had dictated a letter that was to be sent to his family, filled with instructions about the crops in the fields and what was to be planted and when they were to sow and when to harvest. The next day he had gone over the top of his trench to save his wounded Afsar, an English captain whose batman he had been for 5 years and whom he honored above all men. For this he had been awarded, posthumously, the Indian Distinguished Service Medal, which his family had kept in their haveli, in a glass box. And to this day the Afsar's family sends us money, not because we ask, nor from charity, but out of love of my grandfather and to honor what he did for their son. Bela hung upon his words, drinking in every movement of the muscles of his face. "Go on. His father had served in the army too," he said. He had been wounded in Malaya at the time of a rebellion. A stab wound had ripped open his side and pierced his colon. The army doctors had done what they could for him, but the wound had burdened him with chronic, crippling stomach pains. He traveled far afield, visiting experts in Ayurveda and other systems of medicine. The expense had forced him to barter away his share of the family land. He hadn't wanted a fate like that for his Kishan Singh. He'd wanted his son to go to college and understand things. He himself had traveled the world, Malaya, Burma, China, East Africa, and had understood nothing. Kishan Singh too would have liked to go to college, but when he was 14 his father died. After that the option of school was no longer open. The family had needed money. His relatives urged him to report to the local recruitment office. They said that he was lucky to have been born into a caste that was allowed to enroll in the English Sarkar's army. "That was why you joined," he nodded. "Yes, and the women in your village," she said, "what are they like?" "Not like you." She was hurt by this. "Why? What do you mean?" "In a way," he said, "they are soldiers too. From the time they are little they begin to learn what it means to be widowed early, to bring up children without their men, to spend their lives with husbands who are maimed and crippled." Just then she heard her mother calling her name and went running out of the room. For the duration of the wedding, Rajkumar and his family were staying at the Great Eastern Hotel. It was unthinkable, in light of their past hostilities, for Rajkumar to stay with Uma, as Dolly usually did. It had been agreed upon, however, that Neil and Manju would spend their wedding night, their last in Calcutta, in Lankasuka, in Uma's flat. When the day came, Uma and Dolly prepared the bridal bedroom themselves. They went early to the flower market at Kalighat and came back with dozens of loaded baskets. They spent the morning draping the wedding bed with garlands of flowers, hundreds of them. While working, they reminisced about their own weddings and how very different they'd been. In the afternoon they were joined by the second princess, who'd made a special trip from Kalimpong. This completed the circle. It was hot and they were quickly drenched in sweat. "I've had enough," said Dolly. "My wedding was easier. Remember Mrs. Khambatta with the camera?" They sat on the floor, laughing at the memory. As the day progressed, 100 minor crises accumulated. Mainly they concerned odds and ends that someone had forgotten to buy, yet another dhoti for the purohit, a fresh handful of durba grass, a sari for a forgotten aunt, small but essential items. In the late afternoon Arjun was told to organize a quick shopping expedition in the family jowat. Dinu, Uma and Bela were to go with him, each armed with a shopping list. Arjun brought the jowat into the courtyard and the others climbed in. "Where exactly are we going?" Uma asked. "To the market at Kalighat," Arjun said. "Well, you'll have to be quick, then," said Uma. "Why, there's a big demonstration today, we could get cut off." "A demonstration?" Arjun was taken by surprise. "What on earth is it about this time?" This annoyed Uma. "Don't you ever read the papers, Arjun?" she said. "It's an anti-war march. We in the Congress believe that in the event of another war Britain can't expect our support unless they're willing to provide a guarantee of Indian independence." "Oh, I see." Arjun shrugged. "Well, we're safe then. It'll take them a long time to get through all of that." Dinu laughed. It took just 15 minutes to get to the market, and within half an hour their shopping was done. They were on their way back when they turned into a wide avenue and spotted the first of the demonstrators approaching from a distance. "Nothing to worry about," Arjun said calmly. "We're a long way ahead. They won't box us in." But even as he was speaking the jowat's engine began to splutter. And then suddenly the car went dead. "Do something, Arjun," Uma snapped. "We can't stop here." "The spark plug," Arjun muttered incredulously. "I knew I should have cleaned it this morning." "Can't you fix it?" "It's going to take a few minutes." "A few minutes," Uma said. "But they'll be all around us." "Arjun, how could you allow this? These things happen." Dinu and Arjun went around to the front and propped the hood open. The jowat had been idling a good while in the courtyard and the engine was very hot. By the time the plug was fixed, the demonstration had closed around them. Marchers were flowing past on every side, some of them breaking ranks to stare at the stalled car and the two men standing beside the open hood. Arjun and Dinu got back into the car. There was nothing to do but sit and wait until the last demonstrators were passed. A marcher dropped a pamphlet through the car window. Arjun picked it up and glanced down at the front page. There were quotations from Mahatma Gandhi and a passage that said, "Why should India, in the name of freedom, come to the defense of this satanic empire which is itself the greatest menace to liberty that the world has ever known?" Arjun was extremely irritated by this time and he made an angry, spitting noise. "Idiots," he said. "I wish I could stuff this down their throats. You'd think they'd have better things to do than march about in the hot sun." "Watch what you say, Arjun," Uma said sharply from the back seat. "I hope you know that I was meant to be in that march too. I don't think you should be calling them idiots. After all, what do you know about these things?" "Oh, well. .. Quote. Arjun was about to shrug this off when Dinu spoke up. Unexpectedly, in his defense. "I think Arjun's right," he said. "Those people are idiots." "What?" said Uma. "What are you talking about, Dinu?" "I'm talking about fascism," Dinu said, "and why the most important thing right now is to fight it. Because if war does break out, it won't be like any other war. Hitler and Mussolini are among the most tyrannical and destructive leaders in all of human history. They're grotesque, they're monsters. ... If they succeed in imposing their will on the world, we'll all be doomed. Look at what they believe in. Their whole ideology is about the superiority of certain races and the inferiority of others. Look at what they're doing to Jews. And if they have their way, they'll destroy the working class movement everywhere in the world. Their rule will be the most violent and despotic you can imagine, with some races at the bottom and some at the top. ... And don't imagine for a moment that India and Burma will be better off if the British are defeated. ... The government's plan is simply to take over the empire and rule in their place. And think of what'll happen in Asia. The Japanese are already aspiring to an empire, like the Nazis and fascists. Last year, in Nanking, they murdered hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The last we heard from Sire John, he said that many of his wife's relatives had been killed. Lined up against walls and shot. Men, women, children. ... Do you think that if the Japanese army reached India they wouldn't do the same thing here? If you do, you're wrong. They would. They're imperialists and racialists of the worst order. ... If they succeed, it'll be the worst catastrophe in all of human history. Uma responded calmly. Dinu, she said, you must not think for one moment that I, or anyone in the Congress, has an iota of sympathy for the Nazis and fascists. Absolutely not. They are exactly what you say, monstrous, grotesque. As Mahatma Gandhi has said many times, they represent the exact opposite of everything we stand for. But as I see it, we are caught between two scourges, two sources of absolute evil. The question for us is, why should we pick one over the other? You say that Nazism will rule through violence and conquest, that it will institutionalize racialism, that it will commit unspeakable atrocities. All of this is true. I don't dispute it for a moment. But think of the evils you have listed. Racialism, rule through aggression and conquest. Is the empire not guilty of all of this? How many tens of millions of people have perished in the process of this empire's conquest of the world, in its appropriation of entire continents? I don't think there could ever be an accounting of the numbers. Worse still, the empire has become the ideal of national success, a model for all nations to aspire to. Think of the Belgians, racing off to seize the Congo. They killed 10 or 11 million people there. And what was it they wanted, other than to create a version of this empire? Isn't that what Japan and Germany want today, empire of their own? Bela leant over the seat, trying to break in. We have to get back, she cried. We can't just sit here arguing. It's Manju's wedding night. The last of the demonstrators were now past. Arjun started the car and turned it around. They went speeding down the road towards Lankasuka. But the argument was not over so far as Dinu was concerned. He turned round in his seat. Aunt Uma, he said, you're always talking about the evils of empire and what the British have done to India. But do you think that terrible things weren't happening here before they came? Look at the way women are treated even today. Look at the caste system, untouchability, widow burning. All these terrible, terrible things, Uma retorted sharply. Let me be the first to admit the horrors of our own society. As a woman, I assure you that I am even more aware of them than you are. Mahatma Gandhi has always said that our struggle for independence cannot be separated from our struggle for reform. But having said this, let me add that we must not be deceived by the idea that imperialism is an enterprise of reform. Colonialists would like us to believe this. But there is a simple and clear refutation. It is true that India is riven with evils such as those you describe: caste, the mistreatment of women, ignorance, illiteracy. But take the example of your own country, Burma. They had no caste system there. On the contrary, the Burmese were very egalitarian. Women had a high standing, probably more so than in the West. There was universal literacy. But Burma was conquered too, and subjugated. In some ways they fared even worse than we did at the hands of the empire. It is simply mistaken to imagine that colonialists sit down and ponder the rights and wrongs of the societies they want to conquer. That is not why empires are built. Dinu gave a hoarse laugh. Here you are, so full of indignation about the British. And yet you use the English language more often than not. That's neither here nor there, Uma shot back. Many great Jewish writers write in German. Do you think that prevents them from recognizing the truth? From the driver's seat, Arjun gave a shout. Hold on. He threw the car into a steep turn, taking it through the gates of Lankasuka. As they were getting out, they were met by the sound of ululations and the trumpeting of conch shells. They went racing upstairs to find Neil and Manju walking around the fire, his dhoti joined to her sari by a knot. From under the hood of her sari, Manju had been peering about the room, looking everywhere for Arjun. When she finally saw him walking in, dressed in his grease-blackened clothes, her head snapped up, throwing off the hood. Everyone in the room froze, astonished by the sight of an unveiled bride. Just then, a moment before Manju pulled her sari back in place, Dinu's flash went off. Later, everyone was to agree that this was by far the best picture of the wedding. The night was unbearably hot. Bella's bed was drenched with sweat despite the whirring of the electric fan overhead. She couldn't sleep. She kept smelling the scent of flowers, the heady fragrances of the last, hottest nights before the breaking of the rains. She thought of Manju, in her flower-strewn bed downstairs with Neil. It was strange how heat had the effect of heightening the scent of flowers. Her throat was dry, as parched as sand. She got out of bed and went into the hall outside. The house was dark, and for the first time in weeks, there was no one about. The silence seemed almost unnatural, especially after the tumult of the last few days. She tiptoed through the hall to the veranda at the back of the house. There was a full moon, and its light lay on the floor, glinting like silver foil. She glanced at the door of the room where Kishan Singh slept. It was, as always, slightly ajar. She wondered if she should shut the door. Stepping across the veranda, she went up to the door and looked in. She could see him lying on his mat with his longi tucked between his legs. A gust of wind blew the door a little farther open. It seemed cooler inside. She slipped through and seated herself in a corner with her chin on her knees. Suddenly he stirred and sat up. "Who is it?" "It's me, Bela." "Bela." She heard a note of apprehension in his voice, and she understood that it had more to do with Arjun than with herself. That he was afraid of what might happen if she were found in his room, an officer's sister, a girl who'd just turned 15 and was still unmarried. She didn't want him to be afraid. She pushed herself across the floor and touched his hand. "It's all right, Kishan Singh, and what if? Question mark. Everyone's asleep, but still." She saw that he was still afraid, so she stretched out her legs and lay down beside him. "Tell me, Kishan Singh," she said, "when you were married, what was it like, your first night with your wife?" He laughed softly. "It was strange," he said. "I knew that my friends and relatives were at the door listening and laughing." "And your wife? Was she scared?" "Yes, but I was too, even more than her in some ways. Later, when we talked of it with others, we learned that that is how it always is. He could have made love to her then and she would have let him, but she understood that he wouldn't, not because he was afraid but because of some kind of innate decency, and she was glad of this because it meant that it was all right to be there. She was happy just to be lying beside him, aware of his body, knowing that he was aware of hers. "And when your son was born," she said, "were you there?" "No. She was in the village and I was at the base." "What did you do when you heard the news?" "I bought sweets from a halwai and I went to your brother and said, 'Sup, here is some mithai.' He looked at me and asked, 'Why?' So I said, 'Sup, I have a son.'" She tried to think of Arjun in his uniform, talking to Kishan Singh. The picture wouldn't come to life. "My brother, what is he like?" "As a soldier. I mean, he's a good officer. The men, we like him." "Is he hard on you?" "Sometimes. Of all the Indians in our battalion, he's the one who's the most English. We call him the Angrez." She laughed. "I must tell him." Suddenly he clapped a hand over her mouth. "Shush." There was a sound of someone stirring downstairs. He sat up in alarm. "They're flying to Rangoon today," he said. "They'll all be up early. You must go, just a little longer," she pleaded. "It's still night." "No." He pulled her to her feet and led her to the door. Just as she was about to slip out, he stopped her. "Wait." With a hand under her chin, he kissed her, very briefly, but full on the lips. When Neil shook her awake, Manju could not believe that it was already time. "Just a little longer," she pleaded. "Just a few more minutes." He put his chin against her cheek and tickled her with his beard. "Manju, the plane leaves at 4 a.m., he said. "We haven't got time." It was still dark when the chaos of departure got fully underway. Key rings were found and forgotten, suitcases were sat upon and strapped with buckled belts. Doors and windows were locked and checked and locked once again. A final round of tea was served and then, with the neighborhood fast asleep, their luggage was loaded into a car. The family stood around the courtyard, waving. Uma, Bela, Arjun, their parents. Kishan Singh looked on from upstairs. Manju cried a little, but there was no time for long goodbyes. Neil hurried her into the car and shut the door. "We'll be back next year." It was so early that the roads were empty, and it took just half an hour to drive to the Willingdon Air Base on the banks of the Hooghly River. A few minutes later, Dolly, Rajkumar and Dinu arrived. At exactly 4 a.m. They were led to a jetty, where a sleek grey motor launch was waiting. The launch's engine started with a roar and they went shooting upriver, with the decks tilted backwards at a rakish angle. It was very dark, and all Manju could see of her surroundings was the muddy circle of water that was illuminated by the launch's powerful spotlight. The launch slowed and the roar of its engine dwindled to a gentle whine. Its bow dropped back into the water and its spotlight roamed the waters ahead. Suddenly two immense white pontoons loomed out of the water, and then the light climbed higher, illuminating the aircraft that was to take them to Rangoon. The plane was enormous, an 18.5-ton flying boat. The logo of the airline was painted on the plane's tail and a name was written in large letters across its nose, Centaurus. "It's a Martin C-130 seaplane," Neil whispered into Manju's ear. "It's the kind that does the Pacific run for Pan Am, like Humphrey Bogart's plane in China Clipper, yes." He laughed. "And there was one in flying down to Rio too, remember?" With Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, it was when she stepped through the hatch that the full extent of the plane's size became evident to Manju. The interior was as spacious as a ship's lounge, with deep, well-padded seats and glowing brass light fixtures. Manju pressed her nose to the window and saw the propellers starting to spin. Flecks of white froth appeared on the churning brown water below, and then the shuddering fuselage began to advance, and the wake of its bow wave fanned out towards the invisible shore, rocking the little islands of water hyacinth that were floating downriver. A gurgling, sucking sound issued from the pontoons as the plane fought the water's grip, gathering speed. Suddenly the Centaurus shot forward as though catapulted by the beat of wind upon water. Manju saw the wind-drummed waters of the Hooghly falling away as the aircraft rose slowly above the river's steep embankments. Soon the lights of the city were gone and there was only darkness below. They were now flying over the mangrove swamps of the Sundarbans, heading towards the Bay of Bengal. Shortly afterwards a steward took Manju and Neil on a tour of the plane. They went straight through to the navigating bridge, where the captain and the first officer sat side by side, behind identical controls. The first officer explained that the Calcutta-Rangoon flight was only one leg of a fortnightly, 11,000-mile round trip that took the Centaurus from Southampton to Sydney and back. Behind the bridge lay the cabins of the main deck. There was an area for the stewards, a midship cabin, a smoking cabin and a promenade deck, an area that was kept free of seats, so that passengers could stretch their legs in mid-flight. Well appointed as everything was, it was the ingenious design of the kitchen and pantry that took Manju's breath away. In an area that was no larger than the average closet, space had somehow been found for all the amenities of a first-rate restaurant: crockery, linen, silverware and even fresh flowers. With dawn approaching, the steward advised Manju and Neil to go to the promenade deck to watch the sunrise. They stepped through the arched entrance just in time to see the dark expanse of the Sundarbans yielding to the metallic glint of the Bay of Bengal. In the distance a sliver of color had appeared on the horizon, like light leaking through a doorway. The dark skies turned quickly mauve and then a shimmering translucent green, shot with streaks of crimson and yellow. While Dinu was attempting to photograph the sunrise, Manju and Neil crossed the aisle to look in the other direction. Manju cried out loud. To the west lay a stupefying view. The horizon was obscured by a mass of darkness, a bank of cloud that was as vast as a mountain range. It was as though the Himalayas had been magically transported across the sea. So heavy were the cloud banks that their flat bottoms seemed almost to touch the waves, while their peaks towered far, far above the plain, great Everests of cloud reaching tens of thousands of feet into the sky. "The monsoons," Neil said incredulously. "We've run straight into the incoming rains. Is it going to be dangerous?" Manju asked. "In some other aircraft perhaps," Neil said confidently. "But not in this one." They went back to their seats and soon sheets of rain were whiplashing against the windows with a force that made Manju flinch from the glass. Yet the starkly visible violence of the weather had almost no effect upon the plane. The speedometer in the cabin showed the Centaurus to be flying at a steady 200 miles per hour. But a while later the captain announced that the Centaurus would make a change of altitude to ride out the storm. It would descend from its present cruising height of 3,000 feet to a few hundred feet above sea level. Manju fell into a doze and was jolted awake only when a ripple of excitement ran through the plane. Land had been spotted on the starboard side, a picture book island ringed with beaches. Huge waves were disintegrating into sheets of white foam on the sand. At the center of the island there stood a striped black and white tower. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "what we have here is the lighthouse of Oyster Reef. You should have your first glimpse of Burma very shortly. Watch out for the Arakan coast." Then there it was, close enough to touch, a densely clotted carpet of mangrove veined with thin cracks and silver rivulets. As Manju sat looking through the window, Neil whispered into her ear, telling her the story of how his grandmother, Rajkumar's mother, had died somewhere below, on a sampan that was moored in one of those branching inlets. The town of Akyab, the capital of the Arakan, was their first stop. "This," said Neil proudly, "was where my father was born." The airline's base lay in a natural sea lane, a good distance from the town. All they saw of a cab as the Centaurus came down was a clock tower in the far distance. After a quick refueling, the plane was in the air again. The rain stopped, and in the bright daylight the waters of the coast were revealed to be lined with miles of reef and great floating forests of seaweed, all clearly visible from above as stains on the sparkling sea. Rangoon now lay due east, and the Centaurus soon turned inland, flying over a stretch of uninhabited countryside. The steward came by, handing out voluminous leather-bound menus. At the end of her breakfast, Manju found herself looking down on a vista of square paddy fields. Some were already green and others were in the process of becoming so, with lines of workers advancing through the mud, transplanting seedlings. The workers stood up as the plane flew over, throwing their heads back and waving huge conical hats. Manju caught sight of a river curving across the landscape. "Is that the Irrawaddy?" she asked Neil. "No," said Neil. "That's the Rangoon River. The Irrawaddy doesn't flow past the city." Then a glint of sunlight drew her eye to an immense structure far in the distance, a gilded mountain that tapered into a spire of gold. "What's that?" "That's the Shri Dagon Pagoda," Neil whispered in her ear. "We're home." Manju glanced at her watch and saw that the journey had lasted exactly 5.5 hours. It seemed impossible that less than a day had passed since her wedding night, since the time when Neil had shut the door of their flower-bedecked bedroom. She thought of how frightened she'd been and she wanted to laugh. It was only now, circling above the city that was to be her home, that she acknowledged how completely she was in love. He was her present, her future, the entirety of her existence. Time and being held no meaning without him. She slipped her hand into his and looked down again on the great muddy river and the spire of gold. "Yes," she said, "I'm home." Morningside Chapter 2:5. Manju and Neil had been married not quite 3 months when the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, declared war on Germany on behalf of Britain and her empire. With the start of the war, an air raid precautions scheme was prepared for Rangoon. The city was divided into sections and an ARP committee was formed for each. Medical officers were taught to deal with gas injuries, wardens were shown how to identify incendiary bombs, firefighting parties were formed, and first aid centers were set up. Rangoon's water table was too high to allow the building of underground shelters, but slit trenches were dug at strategic points around the city. Periodically there were blackouts, trains entered and left the Rangoon railway station with darkened windows. Wardens and civic guards stayed on duty through the night. There was nothing unsatisfactory about the conduct of these exercises. The city's inhabitants followed their instructions good-humoredly and disturbances were few. But there was no denying the fact that a Rangoon blackout had more the feel of a performance than a drill. The public seemed to be going through the motions without being persuaded either of the imminence of war or of its possible bearing on their lives. Certainly, in Burma, as in India, public opinion was deeply divided. In both places many important personages had expressed their support of the colonial government. But many could also be heard to voice bitter condemnation of Britain's declaration of war on their behalf, without any binding guarantees of eventual independence. The mood among Burma's student activists was summed up in a slogan coined by a charismatic young student leader, Aung San. "Colonialism's difficulty," he said, "was freedom's opportunity." One day, Aung San disappeared. A rumor circulated that he was on his way to China to seek the support of the communists. Later it came to be known that he had gone instead to Japan. But these concerns were relatively distant from the life of the streets, where people seemed mainly to regard the ARP exercises as a species of entertainment, a mass diversion. Merrymakers strolled blithely through the darkened thoroughfares, young people flirted unseen in the parks. Filmgoers flocked to see Ernst Lubitsch's Ninochka at the Metro, When Tomorrow Comes had a long run at the Excelsior, and Irene Dunne was enshrined as one of the city's idols. At the Silver Grill on Fitchey Square, cabarets and dancing continued as usual. Dinu and his friend Thehasaw were among the few who dedicated themselves wholeheartedly to the air raid precautions scheme. At this time, both Dinu and Thehasaw were deeply involved in student union politics. They were on the far left of the political spectrum and were involved in the publication of an anti-fascist magazine. Participating in civil defenses seemed a natural extension of their political work. Dinu still lived at the Kemendine compound, in a couple of rooms at the top of the house. But at home he made no mention of the work he was doing as an art warden, partly because he knew that Neil would tell him that he was wasting his time and needed to do some work, and partly also because experience had led him to assume that his opinions would always be violently at odds with his father's. This was why he was taken completely by surprise at an art warden's meeting when he found himself suddenly face to face with none other than his father. You. There was no telling which of them was the more astonished. After this encounter, there developed for the first time ever a brief bond between Rajkumar and Dinu. The outbreak of war had brought them through opposite routes to a shared position. Rajkumar had come to be convinced that in the absence of the British Empire, Burma's economy would collapse. Dinu's support for the Allied war effort was rooted in other kinds of soil, in his leftist sympathies, in his support for the resistance movements in China and Spain, in his admiration of Charlie Chaplin and Robert Capa. Unlike his father, he was not a believer in colonialism. Indeed, his antipathy to British rule was surpassed only by his loathing of European fascism and Japanese militarism. Whatever the reasons, this was an instance when father and son were in agreement, a situation that was without precedent in the memories of either. For the first time in their lives, they were working together, attending meetings, discussing such matters as the necessity of importing gas masks and the design of wartime posters. So novel was this experience that they both relished it in silence, speaking of it neither at home nor anywhere else. One night an hour blackout was accompanied by a thunderstorm. Despite the rain, Rajkumar insisted on accompanying the wardens on their rounds. He was drenched when he got home. The next morning he woke up shivering. A doctor came and diagnosed pneumonia. Rajkumar was taken to hospital in an ambulance. For the first few days, Rajkumar was barely conscious, unable to recognize Dolly, Dinu or Neil. His condition was judged to be serious enough for the doctors to bar all visitors. For several days he lay in a near coma. Then, slowly, the fever began to recede. In his periods of lucidity, Rajkumar took stock of his surroundings. It so happened that chance had brought him to a familiar place, the hospital room that Dolly and Dinu had occupied 24 years before. Looking around his bed, Rajkumar recognized the view from the window. The Shri Dagon was framed exactly as he remembered. The blue and white curtains were slightly faded but still spotless and crisply starched, the tiled floors were, as ever, sparkling clean, and the dark, heavy furniture was recognizably the same, with inventory numbers stenciled on the varnished wood in white paint. When at last he was well enough to sit up, Rajkumar saw that the room had two additions. One was a carrier air conditioner and the other a bedside radio, a 7-valve Palid with a magic eye, a metal cabinet and chromium-plated mountings. The air conditioner Rajkumar had no use for, but the radio intrigued him. He flipped a switch and found himself listening to a station in Singapore. A newsreader's voice was recounting the latest developments in the war, describing the evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk. After this, Rajkumar kept the radio on most of the time. Each night the nurse would turn it off when she was extinguishing the lights. Rajkumar would wait for her footsteps to die away before turning it on again. He would lie on his side and spin the knob, coasting from station to station. 24 years before, at the time of Dolly's stay in that room, Europe had been convulsed by another war. Dolly too had stayed awake in this room, listening to the sounds of the night. But the whispers she'd heard had come from within the hospital. Now the room was filled with voices from around the world: London, New Delhi, Chongqing, Tokyo, Moscow, Sydney. The voices spoke with such urgency and insistence that Rajkumar began to feel that he had lost touch with the flow of events, that he had become one of those men who sleepwalk their way to disaster by failing to note the significance of what is happening round them. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to think about the way he had been running his businesses. Day after day, month after month, he tried to handle every decision, review all the daily accounts, visit each location, every mill, every yard and outlet. He had been running his company as though it were a food stall in a bazaar, and in the process he had blinded himself to the wider context. Neil had long been pushing for a bigger role in the running of the business. Rajkumar had responded by trying to shut him out. He'd handed him money and told him to go and put it in films, as though he were buying off a child with packets of sweets. The ploy had worked, if only because Neil was too much in awe of him to challenge his authority. Now the business was foundering. This was a fact that he'd refused to face. He'd suppressed hints from his accountants and managers, shouted at them when they tried to give him warning. And the stark fact was that he had no one to blame but himself. He had simply lost sight of what he was doing, and why. As he lay listening to the radio's crackling voices, remorse settled on Rajkumar like a damp, stifling quilt. The doctors pronounced him to be well on the way to complete recovery, but his family could see no sign of an improvement in either his manner or his appearance. He was in his mid-60s at this time, but looked much older. His eyebrows had turned grey and bushy and his cheeks had begun to sag into overlapping dewlaps and jowls. He seemed scarcely to register the presence of the people who came to his room to see him. Often when they tried to speak to him, he would silence them by turning up the radio. One day Dolly unplugged the radio and shut the door. "Rajkumar, what's on your mind? Tell me." At first he wouldn't speak, but she prodded him until he answered. "I've been thinking." "Dolly, what about? Tell me, do you remember how you and Dinu were in this room that time?" "Yes, of course, that night at Vezedi, when Dinu was ill and you said we had to get him to a hospital. I thought you were hysterical. I went along just for your sake." She smiled. "Yes, I know. But you were right, it was just luck, or premonition, that's what you say. But when I look back now, I can see that you often are right. Even though you live so quietly, shut away in the house. You seem to know more about what's happening in the world than I do." "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about what you've been saying these many years." "Dolly, what exactly?" "That we should leave." With a long sigh of relief, Dolly reached for his hand. "So you've been thinking of that at last?" "Yes. But it's hard, Dolly, it's hard to think of leaving. Burma has given me everything I have. The boys have grown up here, they've never known any other home. When I first came to Mandalay, the nakhoda of my boat said, 'This is a golden land, no one ever starves here.' That proved true for me, and despite everything that's happened recently, I don't think I could ever love another place in the same way. But if there's one thing I've learned in my life, Dolly, it is that there is no certainty about these things. My father was from Chittagong and he ended up in the Arakan. I ended up in Rangoon. You went from Mandalay to Ratnagiri and now you're here too. Why should we expect that we are going to spend the rest of our lives here? There are people who have the luck to end their lives where they began them. But this is not something that is owed to us. On the contrary, we have to expect that a time will come when we'll have to move on again. Rather than be swept along by events, we should make plans and take control of our own fate." "What are you trying to say, Rajkumar?" "Just that it doesn't matter whether I think of Burma as home or not. What matters is what people think of us. And it's plain enough that men like me are now seen as the enemy on all sides. This is the reality, and I have to acknowledge it. My job now is to find a way of making sure that Dinu and Neil are provided for." "Surely they're provided for already." Rajkumar paused before answering. "Dolly, I think you're aware that the business hasn't been doing well lately. But you probably don't know the full extent of it, and how bad is that?" "It's not good, Dolly," he said quietly. "There are debts, many of them. But, Rajkumar, if we sold the house, the yards, our share in Morningside, surely something would be left so that the boys could make a start somewhere else." Rajkumar began to cough. "That wouldn't work, Dolly. As things stand at this minute, even if we sold everything it still wouldn't be enough. As for Morningside, Matthew has troubles of his own, you know. Rubber was very badly hit by the depression. We can't rush into this, Dolly, that way we're sure to run into disaster. This has to be done very, very carefully. We have to give it time." "I don't know, Rajkumar." Dolly began to pick worriedly at the end of her hatamain. "Things are happening so fast now. People say that the war may spread, that Japan may get into it, that they could even attack Burma." Rajkumar smiled. "That's impossible, Dolly. You just have to look at a map. To get here the Japanese would have to come across Singapore and Malaya. Singapore is one of the most heavily defended places in the world. The British have tens of thousands of troops there. There are 36-inch guns all along the shore. We can't be chasing after smoke, Dolly, we can't do things in a panic. If this is to work, we have to be realistic, we have to make careful plans." Dolly leant over him to fluff up the pillows on his bed. "So do you have a plan then?" "Not yet, but I've been thinking. Whatever we do, it'll take time, at least a year, maybe more. You have to prepare yourself. I want to make it possible for us to leave Burma with enough so that the boys can settle comfortably somewhere in India or wherever they want to go. And after that, the two of us will be free, to do what? Well, you've already decided you want to live in Zagaing. And what about you? Perhaps I'll come back to Dolly. I sometimes think of living quietly in Wazedi. I'm sure Dose would have a place for me, and it wouldn't be so far from you. Dolly laughed. So you're going to sell everything, uproot all of us, go through all this, just to come back and live quietly in Wazedi? It's not for myself that I'm thinking of doing this, Dolly, it's for the boys. Rajkumar smiled and allowed his head to fall back against his pillows. Once before in his life, he had known himself to be at a crossroads. That had been when he was trying to get his first contract for the Chota Nagpur Railway. He thought hard and come up with a plan that had worked, laying the foundations of his future success. This time too he would have to think of something, a plan that would work. This would be his last challenge, the last hill to cross. After that he would rest. There was no shame in growing old and seeking rest. The first months of the war found Arjun and his battalion on the frontiers of Afghanistan. Arjun was on garrison duty at a small outpost called Charbagh, near the Khyber Pass. The border was quiet, unusually so, the older officers said, and the conflict in Europe seemed very far away. Charbagh was managed by a single company of soldiers, Arjun being the sole officer. The surroundings were spectacularly beautiful, craggy Ocha mountains streaked with great slashes of brilliantly colored rock. There was little to do apart from daily drills, barracks inspections and occasional marches with training columns. Arjun spent long hours reading and soon ran out of books. At regular fortnightly intervals, the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bucky Buckland, stopped by on tours of inspection. The Colorado was a tall, professional-looking man with a ruff of wiry hair clinging to the base of his high-domed, balding head. "And what do you do with your time, Lieutenant?" the CO asked offhandedly on one of his visits. "Do you shoot at all? I've heard there's plenty of game to be had here." "Actually, sir," Arjun said quietly, "I read books." "Oh," the Colorado turned to look at him with new interest. "I didn't take you for a reader. And may I ask what you read?" Their tastes proved to be complementary. The CO introduced Arjun to Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen. Arjun lent him his copies of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds and Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. These exchanges became a pleasurable part of Arjun's life at Charbagh, and he began to look forward to the CO's visits. In between there were long days when nothing happened. There was little to do apart from talking to the occasional traveler. Late in the summer, Arjun's friend Hardy stopped by on his way to his own post, atop the Khyber Pass. Hardy was a quiet, clear-eyed man of medium height and average build. Whether in or out of uniform, he was always neatly dressed, with the folds of his turban laid in precise order and his beard combed tight against his chin. Despite his soldiering background, Hardy did not in any way resemble the Sikh warriors of military law. He was soft-spoken and slow-moving, with an expression of habitual sleepiness. He had a good ear for a tune and was usually the first in the mess to learn the latest Hindi film songs. It was his habit, annoying to some and entertaining to others, to hum these melodies under his breath as he went about his work. These quirks sometimes brought him a little more than his fair share of ragging, yet his friends knew that there were certain limits beyond which he could not be goaded. Although generally slow to take offense, Hardy was inflexible when roused and had a long memory for grudges. Hardy had just spent a period of leave in his village. On his first night at Charbagh, he told Arjun about some odd rumors that he'd heard during his stay. Most of his neighbors had relatives in the army, and some of them had spoken of incidents of unrest. Troops were said to be resisting transfer orders abroad. In Bombay, a Sikh unit, a squadron of the Central India Horse, was said to have mutinied. They had laid down their weapons and refused to board the ship that was to take them to North Africa. 2 men had been executed. A dozen others had been exiled to the prisons of the Andaman Islands. Some of these men were from Hardy's own village. There could be no doubt about the reliability of these reports. Arjun was astonished to hear this. "You should tell Bucky," he said. "He should know. He must know already," Hardy said. "And if he hasn't said anything to us, it must be for a reason." Quote. They looked at each other uneasily and dropped the subject. Neither of them mentioned these stories to anyone else. A few months later, the 1/1 Jats moved back to their battalion's base at Saharanpur, near Delhi. With the descent into the plains, the rhythms of their life underwent a dramatic change. The army was now expanding at a furious pace, regiments were raising new battalions, and headquarters was looking everywhere for experienced personnel. Like every other battalion in the regiment, the 1/1 Jats were milked of several officers and NCOs. Suddenly they found themselves struggling to fill the gaps in their ranks. Newly recruited companies were sent up from the battalion's training center and a fresh batch of officers arrived as replacements for those who'd left. The new officers consisted mainly of expatriate British civilians with emergency commissions, men who had until recently held jobs as planters, businessmen and engineers. They had little experience of the Indian Army and its intricate customs and procedures. Arjun and Hardy were both full lieutenants now and they were among the few regular army officers left in the unit. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland began to depend on them more and more for the day-to-day running of the battalion. First he saddled them with the job of forming a new administrative platoon. Then, sooner than anyone had expected, the battalion's motorized transport was brought up to authorized strength. 3 dozen 1500-weight trucks arrived, along with a dozen smaller lorries. It was discovered that the battalion had mule trainers aplenty but lacked drivers. Arjun was taken off the administrative platoon and appointed motor transport officer. It fell to him to teach the new drivers the tricks of threading heavyweight trucks through Saharanpur's narrow alleys and bazaars. Even as the battalion was adjusting to its new vehicles, a shipment of armaments was sent up from New Delhi, 3-inch mortars, Tommy guns and Vickers Berthier light machine guns. Then came 3 Bren guns with their carriers, 6 medium machine guns and 5 Boys anti-tank rifles, 1 for each company. Hardy was given the responsibility of running weapons training courses for the men. Just as Hardy and Arjun were settling cheerfully into their new jobs, the CO turned everything upside down again. He pulled both Arjun and Hardy from their assignments and set them to work on preparing a unit mobilization scheme. By this time, most of Arjun and Hardy's classmates from the military academy had already been sent abroad. Some were serving in North Africa, some in Eritrea where one had won a Victoria Cross and some in the East, Malaya, Hong Kong and Singapore. Arjun and Hardy assumed that they too would soon be going abroad to join other units of the Indian Army. When the CO asked them to draft a mobilization plan, they took it as a sign that their departure was imminent. But a month went by without any further news, and then another. On New Year's Eve, they saw 1941 in with a van celebration. Despite the ban on shop talk at the mess, the conversation kept returning to the question of where they would be sent, east or west to North Africa or towards Malaya. Opinion was evenly divided. Rajkumar was discharged from hospital with strict orders to remain in bed for at least a month. On returning home, he insisted on being moved up to a room at the top of the house. A bed was brought up and placed by a window. Neil bought a radio, a pallet just like the one in the hospital, and placed it on a table beside the bed. When everything was exactly as he wanted, Rajkumar lay down with a wall of pillows against his back, positioning himself so that he'd be able to look across the city, towards the Shri Dagon. As the days passed, the outlines of a plan began to take shape, very slowly, before his eyes. During the last war the price of timber had soared. The profits he had made then had sustained him for a decade afterwards. It was not too far-fetched to imagine that something similar might happen again. The British and the Dutch were reinforcing their defences throughout the east, in Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Java, Sumatra. It stood to reason that they would need materials. If he could build up a stockpile of timber in his yards, it was possible that he'd be able to sell at a good price next year. The problem was liquidity. He would have to sell or mortgage all his assets to find cash. He would have to get rid of the yards, the mills, the timber concessions, even the Kemendine house. Perhaps he could persuade Matthew to buy him out of Morningside. There might be some cash there. The more he thought of it, the more plausible the plan seemed. The risks were huge, of course, but they always were when anything important was at stake. But the rewards too could be very great, enough to clear his debts and finance a new beginning for Neil and Dinu. And there would be other advantages to arranging things in this way. All his assets would have been disposed of by the time he made his final move. After that he'd be free to leave, nothing to hold him back, nothing more to worry about. One afternoon, when Dolly brought him his meal, he sketched his plan for her. "I think it could work, Dolly," he concluded. "I think it's our best chance." Dolly had many objections. "How is all this to be done, Rajkumar? In your state of health, you can't be up and about, traveling to Malaya and all that." "I've thought of that," he said. "Neil and Dinu will do the traveling, not me. I'll tell them what they have to do. One of them can go up country. The other can go over to dispose of our part of Morningside. Dolly shook her head. Dinu won't agree. He's never wanted to have anything to do with the business, you know that. He doesn't really have a choice, Dolly. If I were to die today, he would find himself paying off my debts whether he liked it or not. All I'm asking is a few months of his time. After that he'll be free to follow his own interests. Dolly fell silent, and Rajkumar reached out to jog her arm. Say something. Dolly, tell me what you think. Rajkumar, Dolly said quietly, this plan of yours, you do know what they call this kind of thing. What? Hoarding, war profiteering. Rajkumar scowled. Hoarding applies to essential commodities, Dolly. That's not what I'll be dealing in. There's nothing illegal about my plan. I'm not talking about the law. Rajkumar's tone grew impatient. Dolly, there's nothing else to be done. We have to take this chance, don't you see? Dolly rose to her feet. Does it really matter what I think, Rajkumar? If this is what you're set upon, then this is what you'll do. It is not important what I think. Late that night, when the whole house was asleep, the telephone began to ring in a hallway downstairs. Dolly got out of bed and ran to pick it up before it woke Rajkumar. She heard an operator's voice, crackling down the line, telling her she had a trunk call. The instrument seemed to go dead for a moment, and then she heard Allison's voice. It was very faint, as though she was shouting across a crowded room. Allison. She heard a sound that was like a sob. She raised her voice. Allison, is that you? Yes, Allison, is everything all right? No, there's bad news. Is it Sayagi? No. There was a sob again. My parents, Allison. I'm so sorry. What happened? They were on holiday. Driving. In the Cameron Highlands. The car went over an embankment. Allison. Allison. Dolly couldn't think of what she was going to say next. Allison, I'd come myself if I could, but Rajkumar isn't well. I can't leave him, but I'll send someone, one of the boys, probably Dinu. It may take a few weeks, but he'll be there. I promise you. The line went dead before she could say anything else. Chapter 26. The day before Arjun's 23rd birthday, he and Hardy borrowed a jeep and drove down to Delhi for the weekend. Walking through the arcades of Connaught Circus, they ran into an acquaintance. Kumar, a debonair and famously fun-loving contemporary of theirs from the academy. Kumar belonged to the 14th Punjab Regiment and his battalion was currently stationed in Singapore. He was in India only briefly, attending a signals training course. Kumar appeared distracted and preoccupied, very different from his usual high-spirited self. They went out for lunch, and Kumar told them about a very strange incident, something that had caused a lot of unease at headquarters. At Singapore's Tai Sal Park camp, an Indian soldier had inexplicably shot an officer and then committed suicide. On investigation, it was discovered that this was no simple murder-suicide. There were undercurrents of unrest within the battalion. Certain officers of this battalion had been heard to say that Indians should refuse to participate in this war, that this was a competition for supremacy among nations who believed it to be their shared destiny to enslave other peoples, England, France, Germany. There was much concern at headquarters. More than half the troops in Malaya were Indian, and it was clear that the colony could become indefensible if unrest were to spread. Despite the incendiary nature of these rumors, the High Command had decided on a judicious and measured response. All that was done by way of disciplinary action was to send one of the battalion's junior officers back to India. It so happened that the officer who was singled out for censure was a Muslim. When news of his punishment reached his battalion, a company of Muslim soldiers proceeded to lay down their weapons in a show of sympathy. The next day, many of the battalion's Hindu soldiers also laid down their arms. At this point, the incident assumed a new gravity. For generations, the British Indian Army had operated on the principle of maintaining a careful balance between the troops. Every battalion was constituted of companies drawn from different castes and religions: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jats, Brahmins. Each company had its own mess, run strictly according to the dietary rules of the group from which the troops had been recruited. As an additional safeguard, infantry divisions were so composed that Indian troops were always balanced by a certain number of Australian or British units. That Hindu and Muslim troops could act together to support an Indian officer came as a shock to the High Command. No one needed to be reminded that nothing of this kind had happened since the Great Mutiny of 1857. At this point, half measures were dispensed with. A platoon of British soldiers from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders was sent in to surround the mutinous Indians. Thus far into the story, Kumar had told them neither the name of the battalion concerned nor that of the officer who was to be punished. When at last he mentioned these, it became clear that Kumar, like the good raconteur that he was, had been saving his punchline for the last. It turned out that the battalion in question was a brother unit of the 1/1 Jats, a part of a Hyderabad infantry regiment. The officer who was being sent home was someone they had all known well at the academy. Kumar concluded the story with an offhand observation, "Going overseas has disturbing effects on the troops," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "On officers too. You'll see, perhaps it won't happen to us," Hardy said hopefully. "There's no certainty that we'll be sent abroad. They'll need forces here too, after all." Arjun was quick to challenge this. "And what would that do for us?" he said. "For you and me. We'll sit out the war and our careers will be dead on their feet. I think I'd rather take my chances abroad." They walked away in silence, not knowing what to make of this conversation. There was something about Kumar's story that defied belief. They both knew the officer who'd been punished. He was a quiet kind of man from a middle-class family. He needed his job if nothing else. What had made him do what he'd done? It was hard to understand. And if the story was true, and they were by no means sure of this, then the incident had other implications too. It meant, for example, that 277 the other ranks were now taking their cues from their Indian officers rather than the High Command. But this was worrying, to them no less than to the High Command, for if the men were to lose faith in the structure of command, then the Indian officers too would eventually be rendered redundant. Only by making common cause with their British counterparts could they hope to prevent this. What would happen if there really were to be a fissure? How would the men respond? There was no telling. Disquieting as the subject was, Arjun felt oddly exhilarated. It was an uncommon responsibility to be faced with such questions at the age of 23. That night they changed into kurtas and churida pajamas and went to a dancer's kotha near Ajmeri Gate. The dancer was in her 40s and her face was painted white, with eyebrows that were as thin as wires. At first glance she looked stony and unattractive, but when she stood up to dance the hardness in her face melted away. Her body was supple and lithe and there was a marvelous lightness in her feet. As the tabla's tempo increased she began to spin, whirling in time to the beat. Her gauzy knee-length angarkha corkscrewed around her in tight spirals. The aureoles of her breasts stood outlined against the thin white cloth. Arjun's throat went dry. When the tabla sounded its climactic stroke, her index finger came to rest on Arjun's forehead. She beckoned to him to follow her. Arjun turned to Hardy in astonishment and his friend smiled and gave him a nudge. "Go. Yaar, it's your birthday, isn't it? Ja." Arjun followed the dancer up a flight of narrow stairs. Her room was small, with a low ceiling. She undressed him slowly, picking at the drawstring of his cotton churida pajamas with her nails. When he reached for her, she pushed his hand away with a laugh. "Wait." She made him lie face down on the bed and massaged a handful of oil into his back, her fingertips tripping over the knuckles of his spine in imitation of the rhythms of a dancer's feet. When at last she lay down beside him, she was still fully clothed. He reached for her breasts and she pushed his hand away. "No, not that." She undid her drawstring and guided him into her body, watching with a smile as he lay on her. When he was done, she slipped quickly away, and it was as though nothing at all had happened. Even her drawstring seemed instantly back in place. She put a finger under his chin and tipped his head back, puckering her lips as though she were looking at a beautiful child. "So young," she said. "Just a boy. I'm 23, he said proudly. She laughed. "You look 16. When Alison first broke the news of her parents' deaths to Sire John, his response had consisted of nothing more than a slight smile. A series of questions had followed, asked almost playfully, as though the situation that was under discussion were at best a remote possibility, an imaginative hypothesis that Alison had propounded in order to explain her parents' prolonged absence from the dinner table. Alison had been so afraid of the impact the news might have on her grandfather that she had gone to great lengths to compose herself, caking makeup over the discoloration of her face and tying a scarf over her disarranged hair. Every eventuality that she could think of she had tried to prepare herself for. But the sight of her grandfather's childlike smile proved beyond her bearing. She got up and ran out of the room. Sire John was now in his late 80s. His lifelong regimen of early morning exercise had served him well, and he was in relatively sound health. His hearing had not deteriorated greatly, and although his eyesight had never been good, he was still able to see his way round the house and grounds. Before the accident, his advancing age had occasionally betrayed itself in a tendency towards confusion. He would often forget things that had been said to him minutes before, while still being able to recall, in minute detail, events that had occurred 40 or 50 years before. The accident greatly accelerated this tendency. Alison could see that contrary to his pretense, the news of her parents' deaths had indeed registered on her grandfather's mind. But his response was not unlike that of a child's reaction to unwelcome noise. He had figuratively stopped his ears with his fingers, in order to shut out what he did not wish to know. With each passing day he spoke less and less. He would come down to eat with Alison, but he'd sit at the hardwood table in blank silence. Such sentences as he addressed to Alison would begin, almost invariably, with observations like, "When Matthew comes back," or, "We must remember to tell Elsa." In the beginning, Alison responded to these remarks with undisguised fury, slamming her hands on the polished table and repeating several times over, "Matthew is not coming back." Quote. At the time, nothing seemed more important than that he should make proper acknowledgement of what had happened. In this she envisaged, if not a lessening of her own grief, then at least a sharing of its burden. But he would smile through her outbursts, and at the end he would carry on where she had interrupted him. "And when they come back," it seemed somehow indecent, even obscene, a profanation of parenthood, that he should respond so blandly to so great a loss. But she saw that her insistence and her banging of tables made no difference, that short of hitting him, she had no means of forcing a rupture in the protective blanket of confusion that he had drawn around himself. She forced herself to gain control of her anger, but this came at the cost of acknowledging a further loss, that of her grandfather. She and her Baba, as she called him, had always been very close. Now it was as though she were being forced to accept that he was no longer a sentient presence in her life, that the comforts of the companionship they had shared had ceased forever, that he who had always been an unfailing source of support had now, in the hour of her greatest need, chosen to become a burden. Of all the betrayals he could have perpetrated, this seemed the most terrible, that he should become a child in this moment of her utter abandonment. She could never have imagined it. These weeks would have been unendurable but for a single fortuitous circumstance. Some years before, acting on a whim, Sire John had adopted one of the plantation workers' children, that boy who's always hanging around the house, Ilongo. The boy had continued to live with his mother, but Sire John had paid for his schooling in the nearby town of Sungei-Patani. Later he had sent him to a technical institution in Penang, and Ilongo had qualified as an electrician. Ilongo was now 20, a dark, curly-haired youth, slow-moving and soft-spoken but of imposing height and build. On finishing his electrician's course, Ilongo had returned to the vicinity of Morningside. His mother now lived in a small, tin-roofed house on the outskirts of the estate. In the aftermath of the accident, Ilongo came often to see Sire John at Morningside House. Gradually, and without an unduly intrusive display of concern, he took over many of the daily functions of caring for the old man. His was an unobtrusive yet quietly reliable presence, and Alison soon found herself looking to him for help in running the plantation's offices. Ilongo had grown up on Morningside and knew every worker on the estate. They in turn accorded him an authority unlike that of anyone else on the plantation. He had come of age on the estate, but he'd also stepped outside its boundaries, learned to speak Malay and English, acquired an education. He had no need to raise his voice or utter threats in order to gain respect. They trusted him as one of their own. Sire John too found reassurance in his company. Every Sunday Ilongo would borrow a truck from the estate and drive him down to the Church of Christ the King in Sungei-Patani. On the way they would stop at the shaded arcades of the red-tiled shophouses that lined the town's main street. Sire John would go into a small restaurant and ask for the proprietor, Arfat, a large man with bright golden sizes. Arfat had political connections in southern China, and Sire John had been a generous contributor ever since Japan's invasion of Manchuria. Each week he would hand Arfat a sum of money in an envelope to be sent on. On those days when he was at Morningside House, it was Ilongo who answered the telephone. One day he came cycling down from the house to see Alison at the estate office. There was a call. From whom? Mr. Dinu Raha. What? Alison was sitting at her desk. She looked up with a frown. Dinu, are you sure? Yes. He was calling from Penang. He's just arrived from Rangoon. He's coming to Sungei-Patani by train. Oh. Allison thought back to the letters that Dolly had written her in the weeks after her parents' deaths. She recalled a reference to an impending visit, but the letter had said it would be Neil who'd be coming, not Dinu. "Are you sure it was Dinu?" she asked Ilongo again. "Yes." She glanced at her watch. "Perhaps I'll go to the station to meet him." He said there was no need, he'd find a taxi. "Oh. Well, I'll see. There's still time." Ilongo left and she sat back in her chair, turning to face a window that looked out over the plantation towards the distant blue of the Andaman Sea. It was a long time since she'd last had a visitor. Immediately after her parents' death, the house had been full. Friends and relatives had come from Penang, Malacca, Singapore. There had been piles of telegrams. Timmy had come all the way from New York, flying across the Pacific on Pan Am's China Clipper. In the overwhelming bewilderment of that time, Allison had found herself praying that Morningside would be filled forever with people. It was inconceivable that she should have to face, on her own, those rooms and corridors, the stairway where every join in the wood was a reminder of her mother. But a week or two had gone by and then the house had emptied just as suddenly as it had filled up. Timmy had left to go back to New York. He had his own business now and couldn't be too long away. In departing, he had as good as handed Morningside over to her to sell or run as she chose. In time, her sense of abandonment had yielded to the understanding that she could not look to the past to fill the gaps in her present, that she could not hope for the lingering traces of her parents' lives to serve as a buffer between herself and the aching isolation of Morningside, the crushing monotony, the solitude that resulted from being always surrounded by the same faces, the same orderly rows of trees, the inescapable sight of the same clouds hanging upon the same mountain. And now here was Dinu, on his way to Morningside, strange old Dinu, so incorrigibly serious, so awkward and unsure of himself. She looked at her watch and at the window. Far in the distance, she could see a train making its way across the plain. She reached for her handbag and found the keys to the Daytona Roadster. It would be a relief to get away, even if just for a couple of hours. Chapter 27. It was because of the war that Dinu's arrival at Morningside was so long delayed. The threat of submarine activity in the Bay of Bengal had forced steamship companies to cease publishing their schedules. Departures were now announced only hours before the time of sailing. This meant, in effect, that a constant vigil had to be maintained at the company's offices. Dinu had considered himself lucky to get a berth at all and had not given any thought to wiring ahead. The station at Sungei Petani was as pretty as a toy. There was a single platform shaded by a low red tiled awning. Dinu spotted Allison as the train was drawing in. She was standing in the shade of the tin awning, wearing sunglasses and a long black dress. She looked thin, limp, wilted, a candlewick on whom grief burnt like a flame. The sight of her induced a momentary rush of panic. Emotion of any kind inspired fear in him, but none so much as grief. For several minutes after the train pulled in, he was literally unable to rise from his seat. It was not till the station master brandished his green flag that he started for the door. Stepping out of the train, Dinu tried to recall the phrases of condolence he had rehearsed in preparation for this moment. But now, with Allison approaching across the platform, the idea of consolation seemed like an impossible impertinence. It would be kinder, surely, to behave as though nothing had happened. "You shouldn't have come," he said gruffly, dropping his eyes. "I would have found a taxi. I was glad to come," she said. "It's nice to have a break from Morningside, still." Hefting his leather camera cases on his shoulders, he handed his suitcase to a porter. She smiled. "Is your father better?" "Yes," Dinu said stiffly. "He's fine now. And Minju and Neil are expecting a baby. That's good news." She gave him a smile and a nod. They stepped out of the station into a compound that was shaded by an immense, dome-like tree. Dinu stopped to look up. From the tree's moss-wrapped branches there hung a colorful array of creepers and wildflowers. "Why," said Dinu, "isn't that a paddock tree? We call them angsana trees here," Allison said. "My father planted this one the year I was born." She paused. "The year we were born," I should have said. "Why, yes. Of course. We were born the same year." Dinu smiled hesitantly, surprised both by the fact that she remembered and that she'd chosen to comment on it. The Daytona was parked nearby, with its hood pulled up. Allison slipped into the driver's seat, while Dinu saw to the loading of his luggage in the back. They drove out of the station and past the main marketplace with its long arcades of tiled shophouses. On the outskirts of town they passed a field that was ringed with barbed wire fencing. At the center of the field there stood several orderly rows of attap huts, roofed with sheets of corrugated iron. "What's this?" Dinu asked. "I don't remember any of this, it's our new military base," said Allison. "Sungei Patani has a big army presence now, because of the war. There's an airstrip in there and it's guarded by Indian soldiers." The road began to climb and Gunung Jere reared up ahead, its peak obscured by the usual daytime heat haze. Dinu sank back in his seat, framing the mountain in an imaginary lens. Allison's voice took him by surprise. "Do you know what the hard part is?" "No, what is it?" "Nothing has any shape." "What do you mean?" "It's something you don't see until it's gone, the shapes that things have and the ways in which the people around you mold those shapes. I don't mean the big things, just the little ones. What you do when you get up in the morning, the hundreds of thoughts that run through your head while you're brushing your teeth. I have to tell mummy about the new flower bed, that sort of thing. Over the last few years I'd started to take over a lot of the little things that daddy and mummy used to do at morningside. Now, when I wake up in the morning, those things still come back to me in just that way. I have to do this or that, for mummy or for daddy. Then I remember, no, I don't have to do any of those things. There's no reason to. And in an odd way, what you feel at those moments is not exactly sadness but a kind of disappointment. And that's awful too, for you say to yourself, is this the best I can do? No, this isn't good enough. I should cry. Everyone says it's good to cry. But the feeling inside doesn't have an easy name. It's not exactly pain or sorrow, not right then. It feels more like the sensation you have when you sit down very heavily in a chair, the breath rushes out of your body, and you find yourself gagging. It's hard to make sense of it, any of it. You want the pain to be simple, straightforward. You don't want it to ambush you in these roundabout ways each morning, when you're getting up to do something else, brush your teeth or eat your breakfast. The car veered suddenly towards the side of the road. Dinu snatched at the wheel to steady it. "Allison, slow down, careful." She ran the car onto the grassy verge that flanked the road and stopped under a tree. Raising her hands, she touched her cheeks in a gesture of disbelief. "Look," she said, "I'm crying." Allison. He wanted to reach for her, touch her shoulder, but it was not like him to be demonstrative. She lowered her forehead to the wheel, sobbing. And then suddenly his hesitations evaporated. "Allison." He drew her head to his shoulder and felt the warmth of her tears dampening the thin cotton of his shirt. Her hair was silky against his cheek and smelled faintly of grapes. "Allison, it's all right." He was struck by a deep astonishment at what he had done. It was as though someone had reminded him that gestures of this kind did not come naturally to him. The arm that was holding her cradled against his shoulder grew heavy and wooden, and he found himself mumbling awkwardly. "Allison, I know it's been hard." He was cut short by the roar of a 1,500-weight truck rolling down the road. Allison pulled quickly away and sat upright. Dinu turned as the truck rumbled by. A squad of Indian soldiers was squatting in the back of the truck, dressed in turbans and khaki shorts. The sound of the truck faded away and the moment passed. Allison wiped her face and cleared her throat. "Time to go home," she said, turning the ignition key. "You must be tired." It was mid-February when the long-awaited mobilization orders finally arrived. Hardy was one of the first to know, and he came running to Arjun's room. "Yaar, have you heard?" It was early evening and Hardy didn't bother to knock. He pushed the door open and looked in. "Arjun, where are you?" Arjun was inside the curtained dressing room that separated his bathroom from the living area. He had just finished washing off the dirt of a football match, and his mud-caked shoes and shorts lay heaped on the floor. It was a Thursday, a night when, by tradition, dinner jackets were worn at the mess, thus being the day of the week when the news of Queen Victoria's death had been received in India. Kishan Singh was at work in Arjun's bedroom, laying out his clothes for the evening dinner jacket. Dress trousers, silk kamaband. Hardy crossed the room quickly. "Arjun, did you hear? We've got the orders." Arjun pulled back the curtain, a towel fastened around his waist. "You're sure?" "Yes." Heard from Adjutant Sab. They looked at each other without knowing what else to say. Hardy seated himself on the edge of the bed and began to crack his knuckles. Arjun started to button his starched dress shirt, flexing his knees so that he could see himself in the mirror. He caught a glimpse of Hardy behind him, staring morosely at the floor. Trying to sound jocular, he said, "At least we'll get to see if those damned mobilization plans that we drew up are any good or not." Hardy made no answer, and Arjun glanced over his shoulder. "Aren't you glad the waiting's over?" "Hardy, Hardy's hands were clasped between his knees. He looked up suddenly. I keep thinking. Of what? Do you remember Chetwood Hall? At the military academy in Dehradun, of course, there was an inscription which said, "The safety, honor and welfare of your country come first, always and every time. The honor, welfare and comfort of the men you command come next. .. And your own ease, comfort and safety come last, always and every time." Arjun laughed as he finished the quotation for Hardy. Of course I remember. It was inscribed on the podium, stared us in the face every time we entered Chetwood Hall. Didn't it ever puzzle you, that inscription? No. Why should it? Well, didn't you ever think, this country whose safety, honor and welfare are to come first, always and every time, what is it? Where is this country? The fact is that you and I don't have a country, so where is this place whose safety, honor and welfare are to come first, always and every time? And why was it that when we took our oath it wasn't to a country but to the King Emperor to defend the empire? Arjun turned to face him. Hardy, what are you trying to get at? Just this, said Hardy. Yaar, if my country really comes first, why am I being sent abroad? There's no threat to my country right now, and if there were, it would be my duty to stay here and defend it. Hardy, Arjun said lightly, staying here wouldn't do much for your career. Career. Hardy clicked his tongue in disgust. Yaar, don't you ever think of anything else, Hardy. Arjun gave him a look of warning to remind him of Kishan Singh's presence. Hardy shrugged and looked at his watch. All right, I'll shut up, he said, standing up to go. I'd better change too. We'll talk later. Hardy left and Kishan Singh carried Arjun's trousers into the dressing room. Kneeling on the floor, he held them open by the waistband. Arjun stepped into them gingerly, taking care not to shatter the fragile sharpness of their glassy creases. Rising to his feet, Kishan Singh began to circle around Arjun, tucking his shirt tails into his trousers. Kishan Singh's hand brushed against the small of Arjun's back and he stiffened. He was on the verge of snapping at his Batman to hurry up when he stopped himself. It annoyed him to think that after 2 years as a commissioned officer he had still not succeeded in training himself to be at ease with the enforced intimacies of military life. This was one of the many things, he knew, that set him apart from the real Fauji's, the born and bred army wallahs like Hardy. He'd once watched Hardy going through this very process of dressing for guest night with his Batman's help. He was oblivious of the man's presence in a way that he, Arjun, never was of Kishan Singh's. Suddenly Kishan Singh spoke up, taking Arjun by surprise. Sub, he said, do you know where the battalion is going? No. Nobody does. We won't know till we're on the ship. Kishan Singh started wrapping Arjun's kamaband around his waist. Sub, he said, the NCOs have been saying that we'll be going east. Why? At first we were training for the desert and everyone said we would be going to North Africa. But the equipment we were sent recently was clearly meant for the rain. Who's been telling you all this? Arjun said in surprise. Everyone, Sup, even in the villages they know. My mother and my wife came to visit last week. They'd heard a rumor that we were about to leave. What did they say? My mother said, Kishan Singh, when are you going to come back? And what did you tell her? Kishan Singh was kneeling in front of Arjun now, checking his fly buttons and smoothing down his trousers, pinching the creases to restore their edge. Arjun could see only the top of his head and the hall patterns of his close-cropped hair. Suddenly, Kishan Singh looked up at him. Sup, I told her that you would make sure that I came back. Arjun, caught by surprise, felt the blood rushing to his face. There was something inexplicably moving about the sheer guilelessness of this expression of trust. He felt at a loss for words. Once, during their conversations at Charbagh, Lieutenant Colonel Buckland had said that the reward of serving in India, for Englishmen of his father's generation, lay in their bonds with the men. This relationship, he had said, was of an utterly different kind from that of the regular British Army, the mutual loyalties of Indian soldier and English officer being at once so powerful and so inexplicable that they could be understood only as a kind of love. Arjun recalled how strange this word had sounded on the CO's reticent lips and how he had been tempted to scoff. It seemed that in these stories, the men figured only as abstractions, a faceless collectivity imprisoned in a permanent childhood, moody, unpredictable, fantastically brave, desperately loyal, prone to extraordinary excesses of emotion. Yet he knew it to be true that even for himself there were times when it seemed as though the attributes of that faceless collectivity, the men, had been conjured into reality by a single soldier, Kishan Singh, that the bond that had come into being between them really was a kind of love. It was impossible to know how far this was Kishan Singh's own doing and how far it was the product of the peculiar intimacy of their circumstances, or was it perhaps something else altogether, that Kishan Singh, in his very individuality, had become more than himself, a village, a country, a history, a mirror for Arjun to see refractions of himself. For an eerie instant Arjun saw himself in Kishan Singh's place, as a batman kneeling before a dinner-jacketed officer, buffing his shoes, reaching into his trousers to tuck in his shirt, checking his fly buttons, looking up from the shelter of his parted feet, asking for protection. He gritted his teeth. Chapter 28. The morning after his arrival, Dinu borrowed a bicycle and went to look for the ruined Chandas of Gunung. Allison drew him a map and he followed it. The track ran uphill most of the way from Morningside House and he had to mount and dismount several times, wheeling his machine up the steeper inclines. He made a couple of wrong turns but eventually found his way to the very spot where Allison had parked her car the last time. The stream lay below and its surroundings were exactly as he remembered. There was a shallow ford, bridged by flat stones. A little lower down the slope, the stream widened into a pool, ringed by massive boulders. On the far side, a narrow path led into the jungle. By this time his right leg was sore and aching. He hung his camera bags on a branch and stepped down to the pool. On the bank there was a boulder that was so shaped as to serve perfectly for a seat. Dinu kicked off his shoes, rolled his trousers up to his knees and plunged his legs into the cool, rushing water. He'd been hesitant about coming to Malaya, but now that he was here, he was glad to be away from Rangoon, glad to leave behind the tensions of the Kemendine house and all the constant worrying about the business. And it was a relief, too, to put a distance between himself and the political infighting that seemed to be consuming all his friends. He knew his father wanted Allison to sell Morningside. It would be too much for her to manage on her own, he'd said. The estate would lose money. But as far as he could tell, Morningside was running smoothly enough and Allison seemed to be very much in control. He couldn't see that she had any need for his advice, but he was glad to be here anyway. It would give him a chance to think things over for himself. In Rangoon he was always too busy, with politics, with the magazine. He was 27 now and this, if any, was the time to decide whether photography was going to be just a hobby or a career. He lit a cigarette and smoked it down to the butt before picking up his camera bags to cross the stream. The path was more overgrown than he remembered, and in places he had to beat down the undergrowth. When he came to the clearing, he was awed by the serene beauty of the place. The colors of the moss-covered Chandas were even more vivid than he remembered. The vistas in the background even more sweeping. He wasted no time in setting up his tripod. He exposed 2 rolls and it was sunset by the time he got back to Morningside House. He went back the next morning and the morning after that. The ride became a regular routine. He'd set off early, taking along a couple of rotters for lunch. When he got to the stream, he'd daydream for a while, sitting on his favorite rock, his legs plunged deep in the water. Then he'd make his way to the clearing and set up his equipment. At lunchtime he'd take a long break and afterwards he'd have a nap, lying in the shade in one of the Chandas. One morning, instead of stopping at the Chandas, he went a little farther than usual. Pushing into the forest, he spotted an overgrown mound a short distance ahead. He beat a path through the undergrowth and found himself confronted with yet another ruin, built of the same materials as the 2 Chandas, laterite, but of a different design. This one was roughly octagonal and shaped like a step pyramid or ziggurat. Despite the monumental design, the structure was modest in size, not much taller than his head. He climbed gingerly up the mossy blocks and at the apex he found a massive square stone with a rectangular opening carved in the center. Looking down, he found a puddle of rainwater trapped inside. The pool had the even shape and metallic glint of an antique mirror. He took a picture, a snapshot, and then sat down to smoke a cigarette. What was the opening for? Had it once been a base for a monumental sculpture, some gigantic, smiling monolith? It didn't matter, it was just a hole now, colonized by a family of tiny green frogs. When he looked down on his rippling reflection, the frogs croaked at him in deep affront. That evening, back at the house, he said to Allison, "Did you know that there was another ruin, a kind of pyramid, a little farther into the jungle?" She nodded. "Yes, and there are others too. You'll find them if you go deep enough." The next day proved her right. Pushing a little farther up the slope, Dinu stumbled, quite literally, on a 10-foot square platform made of laterite blocks, apparently the foundation of a small shrine. The plan of the temple was clearly visible on the floor, laid out like an architect's sketch, with a line of square embrasures indicating the placement of a row of columns. A day or so later he found another, much stranger ruin, a structure that had the appearance of being suspended within an explosion, like a prop in a photographic illusion. A banyan had taken root within the temple and in growing had pushed the walls apart, carrying away adjoining blocks of masonry. A doorway had been split in two, as though a bomb had exploded on the threshold. One stone post had been knocked over, while another had been carried off, coiled in a tangle of greenery, to a distance of several feet off the ground. Sometimes, stepping into the ruins, Dinu would hear a rustle or a prolonged hiss. Occasionally the surrounding treetops would stir as though they'd been hit by a gust of wind. Dinu would look up to see a troop of monkeys examining him warily from the branches. Once he heard a sawing cough that could have been a leopard. As his intimacy with the ruins deepened, Dinu began to find that his eye would go directly to the place where the temple's principal image would once have stood. His hands would reach automatically for the niches where offerings of flowers would have been laid. He began to recognize the limits beyond which he could not step without removing his shoes. When he crossed the stream, after bicycling through the estate, it was no longer as though he were tiptoeing into a place that was strange and unfamiliar, where life and order yielded to darkness and shadow. It was when he crossed back into the monochrome orderliness of the plantation that he felt himself to be passing into a territory of ruin, a defilement much more profound than temporal decay. Late one afternoon, while standing at his tripod, he was alerted to the sound of a car by a commotion among the jungle's birds. He made his way quickly down the path to a vantage point where a gap in the greenery permitted a view of the stream below. He spotted Allison's red Daytona approaching on the far side. He left his tripod standing where it was and went hurrying down the path. Dinu had seen very little of Allison since the day of his arrival. She left the house before dawn, in order to be present at muster, and when she came back, he was usually out on the mountainside taking pictures. They generally met only at dinner time, when conversation was inevitably constrained by Sire John's vacant silences. She seemed not to know how to fit a visitor into the fixed routines of her life on the plantation, and Dinu, for his part, was burdened by the knowledge of the task with which he had been entrusted. He knew that he would have to find a way of telling her that his father wanted to dispose of his share of Morningside, and this seemed impossible at a time when she was so preoccupied, both with the grief of her parents' death and with the daily anxieties of keeping the plantation afloat. By the time Dinu reached the end of the path, Allison had crossed the stream. Finding himself face to face with her now, he couldn't think of what to say and began to fumble in his pockets for a cigarette. Going back to the house, he said at last through his teeth, while striking a match, "I thought I'd come by and see how you were getting on. I was just setting up my camera." Quote. He walked with her to the clearing, where his tripod was placed in front of one of the chandas. "Can I watch you take pictures?" she asked brightly. He hesitated, raising the cigarette to his mouth, squinting into the smoke. As though sensing a reluctance, Allison said, "Would you mind?" "Would I be bothering you?" "No," he said. "It's not that. You wouldn't be bothering me exactly. It's just that when I'm shooting I have to concentrate very hard. Or it's a waste. It's like any other kind of work, you know. It's not easy to do if you're being watched." "I see." The hollow sound of her voice indicated that she'd read this as a rebuff. "Well, I'll go, then." "No," he said quickly, "please stay." "But then, if you're going to be here, could I take a few pictures of you?" She was quick to deal out a rebuff of her own. "No, I'm not really in the right frame of mind to become a part of your work." She turned on her heel and headed down the path towards the stream. Dinu knew himself to be stranded unwittingly in a quarrel. "Allison, I didn't mean." Quote. He hurried after her, but she was walking fast and his leg put him at a disadvantage. "Allison, please stay." He caught up with her at the edge of the stream. "Allison, I was just telling you what it's like when I make a picture. I didn't mean to put you off. Won't you stay?" "Not now." She glanced at her watch. "Not today. Then you'll come back." She'd already started across the ford. In midstream, without turning around, she raised a hand to wave. Just before the battalion's departure from Saharanpur, new war equipment tables arrived. This meant that Arjun and Hardy had to stay up all night revising their carefully prepared unit mobilization scheme. But in the end all was well. The CO was pleased and the battalion was able to go ahead with its entrainment as planned. The train left for Bombay on schedule. At Ajmer there was a slight delay. The 1/1 jats were shunted aside so that a trainload of Italian prisoners of war could pass by. The Italians and Indians stared at each other in silence across the platform, through the barred windows of their respective carriages. This was their first glimpse of the enemy. Next morning, they arrived at Bombay's Victoria terminus. They were told that their troop ship, the HMT Nuwara was waiting at the harbour. They drove to the Seasson docks to find that their embarkation orders had already been issued. The docks proved to be unexpectedly congested. It turned out that a British battalion was boarding another ship at exactly the same time. Soon the two battalions' baggage and equipment were hopelessly entangled with each other. NCOs began to shout, spreading panic among the dock workers. Hardy was thrown into the midst of the confusion. He was the baggage officer for the 1/1 jats and it fell on him to try and restore order. Looking in Hardy's roster, Arjun learned that he had been allotted a cabin to himself. He had never been on a ship before and was barely able to contain his excitement. He went hurrying up the gangplank to look for his cabin, with Kishan Singh following close behind, carrying his luggage. They were the first to board and the ship was empty but for its crew. Everything seemed new and startling, the wide gunnels and narrow catwalks, the yawning hatches and the rounded frames of the portholes. As they were stepping onto the upper deck, Kishan Singh happened to glance over the side. "Sup, look," he pointed, drawing Arjun's attention to an altercation on the docks below. Arjun saw that Hardy had got himself into a shouting match with a hulking British sergeant. They were standing toe to toe, with Hardy shaking a sheaf of papers under the sergeant's nose. "Stay here." Arjun went racing down the way he had come. He arrived on the scene just a moment too late. Another officer from their battalion had got there before him, Captain Pearson, the adjutant, a bluff, stocky Englishman with a booming voice and a quick temper. Watching from a few paces away, Arjun saw Hardy turning to Captain Pearson. It was clear that Hardy was relieved to see the adjutant, fully confident that his senior would back him up out of loyalty to a fellow member of the battalion, if nothing else. But Captain Pearson had never made a secret of his belief that Hardy was difficult and overly sensitive. Instead of supporting him, he let his annoyance show. "Lieutenant, have you got yourself into a row again?" Arjun saw the look on Hardy's face change from relief to seething outrage. It was painful to stand there as a silent witness to his friend's humiliation. He turned and slipped away. Later that day, Hardy came to his cabin. "We've got to teach that bastard Pearson a lesson," he said. "That bloody sergeant called me a stinking nigger in front of the men. Pearson let him get away with it. Yar, would you believe it, the bugger blamed me. The only way we can stop this kind of thing is by sticking together." "What exactly do you mean?" "I think we should boycott him. He's the adjutant, Hardy," Arjun said. "How can we boycott him?" "Be reasonable, there are ways of getting a message across," Hardy said angrily. "But that can happen only when you know which side you're on." Rising abruptly to his feet, he left Arjun's cabin. For 2 days the Nuwara waited offshore while 9 other ships assembled in the harbour. There was a rumor that a German submarine was lurking nearby and the ships were assigned an escort of 2 destroyers, an armed merchantman and a light cruiser. When the convoy finally departed, it was in a westerly direction, heading towards the setting sun. Their destination was still unknown. They had no idea whether they were to go east or west. In Bombay, the CO had been handed a sealed envelope that was to be opened exactly 24 hours after their departure. When the time came, Arjun and the other officers gathered in a dining room on the Nuwara's upper deck. The Colorado opened the envelope in his usual deliberate way, prizing the seal off the paper with a knife. The officers waited in expectant silence. Arjun could feel a clammy dampness welling up in the palms of his hands. Then, at last, the CO looked up with a thin smile. He held the sheet of paper in front of him and read out aloud, "The ship is headed for Singapore." Arjun stepped out on deck and found Hardy already there, leaning over the gunwale, humming softly under his breath. Behind them the white ribbon of the ship's wake had already begun to describe a curve as the convoy slowly changed direction. Chapter 29. Manju had never been happier than she was in the first months of her pregnancy. She relished every reminder of her changing condition. The often imaginary twitches and movements, the pangs of hunger that could never be properly satisfied, even the nausea that woke her every morning and the acid tingling of her teeth. The Kemendine house had changed greatly in the 2 years she'd been in Rangoon. Dinu was gone, of course, and his apartment upstairs lay empty. Neil and Rajkumar were often away, arranging for the disposal of the family's properties or buying new stocks of teak. For much of the time Manju and Dolly had the house to themselves. The compound had grown unkempt, where there had once been a lawn, the grass now stood knee-high. Many rooms and outhouses were locked up, much of the furniture had been sold. The dozens of employees who had once populated the place were gone, the servants, watchmen, gardeners and their families. Even Yuba Kyo, the chauffeur, had gone back to his village. The Packard was one of the few disposable possessions that Rajkumar had retained, but it was now driven mainly by Neil. Neither Manju nor Dolly regretted the emptying of the house. On the contrary, it was as though an enormous accumulation of cobwebs had been swept away, allowing them new and unaccustomed freedoms. In the past Dolly had often seemed remote and unapproachable to Manju, but now they became allies, colleagues, teammates, working together for the family's renewal. Between the two of them they had little difficulty in managing the house. On waking in the morning, Manju would find Dolly on her knees, dressed in a frayed old longi, wiping the floors with tattered shreds of cloth. They would work together, going through a couple of rooms each day, breaking off when the monks came by for their daily visits. For Manju these mid-morning breaks were the best-loved aspect of daily life in Rangoon. She'd always known that Buddhist monks lived by collecting alms, but it came as a surprise to observe the ways in which this tenet, more or less abstract, came to be translated into the mundane mechanics of everyday life, into the workaday reality of a tired-looking group of young men and boys walking down a dusty street in saffron robes with their baskets balanced on their hips. There was something magical about the fact that this interruption came always at a time of day when the tasks of the household were at their most pressing, when there was scarcely room in one's head but to think about what had to be done next. And in the midst of all that, to open the door and see the monks standing there, waiting patiently, with the sun beating down on their shaven heads, what better way could there be of unbalancing everyday reality? Calcutta seemed very far away now. The flow of letters from India had suffered disruptions because of the threat of submarines in the Bay of Bengal. Steamer traffic between Calcutta and Rangoon had become so irregular that letters tended to arrive in bunches. One such bunch brought news both of Arjun's impending departure and of his arrival in Malaya. Dolly was very glad to hear of this development. Perhaps Arjun could find out what's become of Dinu, she said. It's a long time since we last heard from him. Yes, of course. I'll write. Manju sent a letter to the address her father had provided via Army headquarters in Singapore. Many weeks went by without an answer. Don't worry, Manju said to Dolly. I'm sure Dinu's fine. We'd have heard if anything was wrong, you're probably right. But a month passed and then another and Dolly seemed to become resigned to her son's continuing silence. The baby was now kicking urgently against the walls of Manju's stomach and she had no attention to spare for anything other than her own condition. With the approach of the monsoons, the days grew hotter and the effort of carrying the child grew very much greater. Sooner than they had expected, the festival of Vaso was upon them. Dolly took Manju on a drive into the countryside in a taxi rented for the day. They stopped in a wooded area off the Pagu road and collected armloads of fragrant yellow puddock flowers. They were on their way back to Rangoon when Manju had a dizzy spell and fainted on the back seat. After this episode the doctor confined Manju to bed. Dolly became her nurse, bringing her food, helping with her clothes, occasionally leading her around the compound. The days went by in a kind of trance. Manju would lie dreamily in bed with a book beside her, open but unread. Hours would pass while she did nothing but listen to the sound of the pouring rain. They were now well into Thardeen, the annual 3-month period of reflection and abstinence. Often Dolly would read to Manju, mainly from the scriptures, from such translations as she could find, since Manju knew neither Pali nor Burmese. One day Dolly chose a discourse by the Buddha, addressed to his son, Rahula. She read, "Develop a state of mind like the earth, Rahula, for on the earth all manner of things are thrown, clean and unclean, dung and urine, spittle, pus and blood, and the earth is not troubled or repelled or disgusted." Manju watched her mother-in-law as she read. Dolly's long, black hair was slightly flecked with grey and her face was etched with a webbing of lines. Yet there was a youthfulness in her expression that belied these signs of age. It was hard to believe that this was a woman in her mid-60s. Develop a state of mind like water, for in the water many things are thrown. Clean and unclean, and the water is not troubled or repelled or disgusted. And so too with fire, which burns all things, clean and unclean, and with air, which blows upon them all, and with space, which is nowhere established. Dolly's lips seemed hardly to move, and yet every word was perfectly enunciated. Manju had never before known anyone who could appear to be in repose when she was actually at her most intently wakeful, her most alert. When Manju reached the 8th month of her pregnancy, Dolly banned Neil from any further travels. He was at home when Manju's labor started. He helped her into the Packard and drove her to the hospital. They could no longer afford the private suite that Dolly and Rajkumar had taken before, and instead Manju went into the general maternity ward. The next evening she was delivered of her child, a healthy, sharp-voiced girl, who began to suckle the moment she was put to Manju's breast. The baby was given 2 names. Jaya was to be her Indian name and Tinmay the Burmese. Exhausted by her labor, Manju fell asleep. It was dawn when she woke up. The baby was in her bed again, rooting hungrily for her feed. Holding her daughter to her breast, Manju remembered a passage that Dolly had read to her just a few days before. It was from the Buddha's first sermon, delivered at Sarnath 2500 years before. Birth is sorrow, age is sorrow, disease is sorrow, death is sorrow, contact with the unpleasant is sorrow, separation from the pleasant is sorrow, every wish unfulfilled is sorrow. The words had made a great impression on her at the time, but now, with her newborn daughter beside her, they seemed incomprehensible. The world had never seemed so bright, so replete with promise, so profligate in its rewards, so generous in its joys and fulfillments. For their first few weeks in Singapore, the 1/1 Jats were based at the Taisal Park camp. This was the very place that Arjun's friend Kumar had talked about, where a soldier had shot an officer and then committed suicide. In New Delhi, the story had sounded unlikely and far-fetched, an extreme situation, like a report of a mother lifting up a car to save her children. But now that they were in Singapore themselves, with India half a continent away, nothing seemed improbable anymore. Everything appeared to be turned on its head. It was as though they no longer knew who they were, no longer understood their place in the order of things. Whenever they ventured beyond the familiar certainties of the battalion, they seemed to lose themselves in a labyrinth of hidden meanings. It so happened that Kumar was in Singapore when the 1/1 Jats first arrived. One afternoon he took Arjun and Hadi to an exclusive club for a swim. The pool was very crowded, filled with European expatriates and their families. It was a hot, sticky day and the water looked cool and inviting. Following Kumar's lead, Arjun and Hadi jumped in. Within a few minutes they found themselves alone. The pool had emptied as soon as they entered the water. Kumar was the only one who was not taken aback. His battalion had been in Malaya more than a year and he had travelled all round the colony. "I should have warned you about this," Kumar said with a mischievous smile. "It's like this everywhere in Malaya. In smaller towns, the clubs actually put up signs on their doors saying, 'No Asiatics allowed.' In Singapore they let us use the pool, it's just that everyone leaves. Right now they've had to relax the color bar a little because there are so many Indian Army units here. But you may as well get used to it because you'll come across it all the time, in restaurants, clubs, beaches, trains." He laughed. "We are meant to die for this colony, but we can't use the pools." Ruefully shaking his head, he lit a cigarette. Soon their battalion was sent north. The Malayan countryside was a revelation to the Indian officers. They had never seen such prosperity. Such beautiful roads, such tidy, well laid out little towns. Often, when they stopped, the local Indian residents would invite them to their houses. These were usually middle-class people with modest jobs, provincial lawyers and doctors, clerks and shopkeepers. But the signs of affluence in their homes were such as to amaze Arjun and his fellow soldiers. It seemed that in Malaya even ordinary people were able to afford cars and refrigerators, some even had air conditioners and telephones. In India only Europeans and the richest of rich Indians could afford such things. Driving along rural roads, the officers discovered that in Malaya the only people who lived in abject, grinding poverty were plantation laborers, almost all of whom were Indian in origin. They were astonished at the difference between the plantation's ordered greenery and the squalor of their coolie lines. Hadi once remarked on the starkness of the contrast, and Arjun responded by pointing out that in India, they would have taken such poverty for granted, that the only reason they happened to notice it now was because of its juxtaposition with Malaya's prosperous towns. This thought made them both cringe and shame. It was as though they were examining their own circumstances for the first time, in retrospect. as though the shock of travel had displaced an indifference that had been inculcated in them since their earliest childhood. Other shocks awaited. Out of uniform, Arjun and his friends found that they were often mistaken for coolies. In markets and bazaars, shopkeepers treated them offhandedly, as though they were of no account. At other times, and this was worse still, they would find themselves being looked upon with something akin to pity. Once Arjun got into an argument with a shopkeeper and found himself being called clank to his puzzlement. Later, inquiring about the meaning of this word, he discovered that it was a derogatory reference to the sound of the chains worn by the earliest Indian workers who had been brought to Malaya. Soon it seemed as though there was not a man in the battalion who had not found himself embroiled in an unsettling encounter of one kind or another. One evening, Kishan Singh was oiling Arjun's revolver, squatting on the floor, when he looked up suddenly. "Sup," he said to Arjun, "can I ask you the meaning of an English word?" "Yes." "What is it?" "Mercenary." "What does it mean, mercenary?" Arjun started in surprise. "Where did you hear this word?" Kishan Singh explained that during one of their recent moves, their convoy of trucks had stopped at a roadside tea stall near the town of Ipoh. There were some local Indians sitting in the tea stall. They had announced themselves to be members of a political group, the Indian Independence League. Somehow an argument had started. The civilians had told them that they, the 1/1 Jats, weren't real soldiers, they were just hired killers, mercenaries. A fight would have broken out if the convoy hadn't got underway again. But later, when they were back on the road, they had begun to argue again, with each other this time, about the word mercenary and what it meant. Arjun's instinct was to bark an order at Kishan Singh, telling him to shut up and get on with what he was doing. But by now he knew his Batman well enough to be aware that an order would not deter him from looking for an answer to his question. Thinking quickly, Arjun embarked on an explanation. "Mercenaries were merely soldiers who were paid for their work," he said. "In this sense, all soldiers, in all modern armies, were mercenaries. Hundreds of years ago, soldiers had fought out of religious belief, or because of allegiance to their tribes, or to defend their kings. But those days were long past. Now soldiering was a job, a profession, a career. Every soldier was paid and there was none who was not a mercenary." This seemed to satisfy Kishan Singh, and he asked no more questions. But it was Arjun himself who now came to be troubled by the answer he had given his Batman. If it were true, and it undoubtedly was, that all contemporary soldiers were mercenaries, then why did the word have the sting of an insult? Why did he feel himself smarting at its use? Was it because soldiering was not just a job after all, as he had taught himself to believe? That to kill without conviction violated some deep and unalterable human impulse. One night he and Hardy stayed up late, discussing this subject over a bottle of brandy. Hardy agreed that it was hard to explain why it was so shameful to be called a mercenary. But it was he who eventually put his finger on it. "It's because a mercenary's hands obey someone else's head. Those two parts of his body have no connection with each other." He paused to smile at Arjun. "Because, yaar, in other words, a mercenary is a buddhu, a fool." Arjun refused to be drawn into Hardy's jocularity. He said, "So are we mercenaries, do you think?" Hardy shrugged. "All soldiers are mercenaries today," he said. "In fact, why just stop with soldiers? In one way or another we're all a little like that woman you went to in Delhi, dancing to someone else's tune, taking money. There's not that much difference." He tipped back his glass with a laugh. Arjun found an opportunity to take his doubts to Lieutenant Colonel Buckland. He told him about the incident at the tea stall and recommended that the other ranks' contacts with the local Indian population be more closely supervised. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland heard him out patiently, interrupting only to nod assent. "Yes, you're right, Roy, something must be done." But Arjun came away from this conversation even more disturbed than before. He had a feeling that the lieutenant colonel could not understand why he was so outraged at being described as a mercenary. In his voice there had been an undertone of surprise that someone as intelligent as Arjun could take offense at something that was no more than a statement of fact. It was as though the lieutenant colonel knew something about him that he, Arjun, either did not know or was not willing to recognize. Arjun was embarrassed now to think that he'd allowed himself to go off at the deep end. It was as though he were a child who'd taken umbrage at the discovery that he'd spoken prose all his life. These experiences were so peculiar, so provocative of awkward emotions, that Arjun and the other officers could rarely bring themselves to speak of them. They had always known their country to be poor, yet they had never imagined themselves to be part of that poverty. They were the privileged, the elite. The discovery that they were poor too came as a revelation. It was as though a grimy curtain of snobbery had prevented them from seeing what was plainly before their eyes, that although they had never been hungry, they too were impoverished by the circumstances of their country, that such impressions as they'd had of their own well-being were delusions, compounded out of the unimaginable extremity of their homeland's poverty. The strange thing was that even more than Arjun, it was the real Fauji's, the second and third generation army wallahs, on whom these experiences had the most powerful effect. "But your father and grandfather were here," Arjun said to Hardy. "It was they who helped in the colonization of these places. They must have seen some of the things that we've seen. Did they never speak of all this?" "They didn't see things as we do," Hardy said. "They were illiterate. Yar, you have to remember that we're the first generation of educated Indian soldiers. But still, they had eyes, they had ears, they must occasionally have talked to local people," Hardy shrugged. "The truth is, Yar, they weren't interested, they didn't care, the only place that was real to them was their village. How is that even possible?" In the following weeks Arjun thought often of this. It was as though he and his peers had been singled out to pay the price of a monumental inwardness. With every day that he spent on the mountainside, Dinu could feel his pictures changing. It was as though his eyes were adjusting to unaccustomed lines of sight, as though his body were adapting to new temporal rhythms. His earliest pictures of the Chandas were angular and densely packed, the frames filled with sweeping vistas. He saw the site as being replete with visual drama: the jungle, the mountain, the ruins, the thrusting vertical lines of the tree trunks juxtaposed against the sweeping horizontals of the distant sea. He labored to cram all these elements into his frames. But the more time he spent on the mountain, the less the background seemed to matter. The vastness of the landscape had the effect of both shrinking and enlarging the forest-enclosed clearing in which the Chandas stood. It became small and intimate, but saturated with a sense of time. Soon he could no longer see either the mountains or the forest or the sea. He found himself moving closer and closer to the Chandas, following the grain of the laterite and the pattern of the moss that covered its surface, trying to find a way of framing the curiously voluptuous shapes of the toadstools that grew within the joins of the stone. The rhythms of his work changed in ways that he could not fully control. Hours would go by before he made a single exposure. He would go back and forth dozens of times between his camera and his subject. He began to stop his lens farther and farther down, experimenting with aperture settings that required exposures of several minutes at a time, even as much as half an hour. It was as though he were using his instrument to mimic the pinprick eyes of the lizards that sunned themselves on the Chandas floors. Many times each day, inexplicable perturbations would sweep through the surrounding forests. Flocks of birds would rise screaming from the surrounding trees and go boomeranging through the skies, only to settle back in exactly the same spots from which they had risen. To Dinu, each of these disturbances now seemed like an augury of Allison's arrival, and in listening for their causes, sometimes the backfiring of a truck on the estate, sometimes a plane coming into land at the nearby airstrip, his senses came to achieve an uncannily close attunement to the sounds of the forest. Every time the trees were shaken alive, he would break away from his work, straining to catch the sound of the Daytona. Often he would go running down the path to the gap where he could look down on the ford. As the disappointments mounted, he grew steadily more impatient with himself. It was plain idiocy to imagine that she'd drive out this way again. Considering the last time, and in any event, why come all the way here when she would see him in the house at dinner time? But then one day there really was a glimmer of red on the far side of the stream, and the Daytona really could be seen to be standing under a tree, half obscured by a tangle of greenery. Dinu looked once more, incredulously, and spotted Allison. She was dressed in a dark blue cotton frock with a white belt tied around her waist. But instead of making her way to the ford, she was heading downstream, to the very rock where he sat every morning, dangling his legs in the pool. He could tell from the practiced way in which she seated herself, swinging her feet up and then pivoting around to plunge them into the water, that this was a familiar place, a spot where she often came to be alone. As her feet slid beneath the water, her fingers picked at the hem of her skirt and pulled it back. The water rose past her ankles, to her knees, and with it her skirt rose too, slowly climbing the long line of her thigh. Now, to his surprise, he made the discovery that he was no longer looking at her directly, but through the ground glass of his viewfinder, so that the image was partitioned from its surroundings and endowed with a startling clarity and vividness. The lines were clean, pure, beautiful, the curve of her thigh crossing his viewfinder diagonally, describing a gentle ellipsis. She heard the click and looked up, startled, her fingers instantly loosening their grip on her skirt so that the fabric dropped into the water and ballooned around her, swirling in the current. "Dinu," she called out. "Is that you?" He had only this one chance now, he knew that, and he was powerless to stop himself. He stepped away from the gap and began to walk down the path, moving with the slow deliberation of a sleepwalker, holding his camera immobile in front of him. "Dinu." He didn't try to answer but kept on moving, concentrating on the placing of one foot in front of the other, until he was clear of the greenery. From the far side of the pool, she looked into his eyes and swallowed back the words of greeting she'd been about to utter. Dinu kept on walking. He dropped his camera on the grass and walked straight down the sandy bank into the pool, directly across from the spot from where she sat. The water rose to his knees as he waded in, then to his groin, his hips, almost to his chest. The current began to tug at his clothes and his thin canvas shoes filled with sand and grit. He slowed to keep his footing, and then he saw her feet hanging in the water, rippling in the current. He kept his eyes fixed on the shimmering flow, and when his hands made contact with her legs he felt a deep breath rising from his lungs. It was the water that made this possible, he was sure of that. It was the stream that had washed away the barriers of fear and hesitation that had chained his hands before. He began to move his fingers, up the curve of her ankle, along the fine edge of her shin bone. Then his hands began to move on their own, pulling him behind them, between her parted knees, until suddenly her thighs were level with his face. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to follow his hands with his mouth, to move his lips along the elliptical line of her thigh, all the way along its length until the line parted. There he came to a stop, his face buried in her, his arms raised to shoulder height, holding her around her waist. "Allison." She slid off the rock and stood neck deep in the water beside him. Taking his hand, she led him back through the pool, exactly the way he had come, to the other bank. They walked hand in hand, fully clothed and dripping wet, up the path that led to the ruined Chandas. She took him through the clearing, up to a stone floor where a bed of moss lay thick on the laterite. Then she reached for his hand and pulled him down. Chapter 3. Oh, neither Arjun nor anyone else in the 1/1 Jats knew quite what to expect when they arrived at Sungai Patani. Before their departure from Ipoh they had been briefed sketchily on the problems they might encounter there. They knew that a mutiny had been narrowly averted just a few months before, but they were still unprepared for the cloud of disquiet that shrouded the base. The troops at the Sungai Patani base belonged to the 1st Bahawalpur Regiment. There had been a lot of friction between the battalion's officers and their English company. Their CO had taken no pains to disguise his low opinion of his Indian officers. He'd been known to call them coolies and to threaten them with his swagger stick. On one infamous occasion he had even kicked an officer. Things had got so bad that the GOC of the 11th Division had had to intervene personally. The CO had been relieved of his command and a number of officers had been sent home to India. At their briefing the 1/1 Jats had been given to understand that these measures had substantially altered the situation, that the difficulties of the past had been resolved. But within a day of their arrival at Sungai Patani it was evident that the troubles of the Bahawalpurs were far from over. Through the whole 2 hours of their first meal at the Bahawalpurs mess hardly a word was exchanged between their British and Indian officers. And if the tensions in the Bahawalpur's mess were clearly visible to Hardy and Arjun, they were certainly no less so to Lieutenant Colonel Buckland. Over the next 2 days the Lieutenant Colonel made a point of speaking to his officers individually, to let them know that fraternization with the 1st Bahawalpurs would not be encouraged. In a way Arjun was glad. He knew this to be the right approach under the circumstances and was more than ever grateful to have a commanding officer of the caliber and good sense of Lieutenant Colonel Buckland. But the knowledge of this did not ease any of the small difficulties that arose in trying to avoid the Bahawalpur's officers, some of whom were acquaintances from the academy. Arjun had a room to himself, like all the officers of the 1/1 Jats. Their quarters, men and officers alike, consisted of attap huts, wooden barracks with palm-thatched roofs. These structures were mounted on pillings that were designed to keep out termites and damp. Yet both insects and moisture figured large in the experience of living inside these barracks. The beds were frequently preyed upon by swarms of ants. After nightfall mosquitoes were so numerous that to climb out of bed for even a minute meant having to restring the whole mosquito net. The roofs often dripped and at night the rustling palm thatch seemed to come alive with rats and snakes. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland wanted the 1/1 Jats to use their time at Sungei Patani on combat training, but circumstances conspired to confute all his plans. When they ventured into the surrounding rubber plantations, the planters protested. Their attempts to acquaint the men with the terrain had to be called off. Then the medical corps began to complain about rising rates of malaria. As a result, their plans for night training had to be cancelled. Frustrated in his more imaginative schemes, the CO set the battalion to a monotonous regimen of constructing fortifications around the base and the airstrip. The airfield at Sungei Patani consisted of just a single concrete runway and a few hangars, but it was still one of the few bases in northwestern Malaya that boasted an operational air squadron. The airmen at the base could on occasion be persuaded to provide joy rides in their heavy-bellied Blenheims and Brewster buffaloes. Arjun went on several of these rides. Circling above the slopes of Gunung Jere, looking down on the rubber plantations, swooping low over the grand houses and villas. At the summit of the mountain there stood a small lodge that served as a popular destination for holidaymakers. The pilots would often buzz the lodge, passing so close that the joy riders could wave to the diners sitting at the tables on the veranda. Through his first few weeks at Sungei Patani, Arjun had no idea that Dinu was living nearby. He was dimly aware that the Rahas owned shares in a rubber estate in Malaya, but he had no idea of where this plantation was. The first he knew of it was when he received a letter from Manju. Posted in Rangoon, Manju was unaware of her twin's exact location and knew only that he was somewhere in Malaya. She wrote to say that she was well and that her pregnancy was proceeding smoothly enough. But Neil and his parents were worried about Dinu. He'd gone over to Malaya several months before and hadn't been heard from for a while. They would be glad if Arjun would look him up. He was probably staying at the Morningside estate with Allison, who had recently lost her parents. She provided a postal address. Later in the day, Arjun borrowed an Alvas staff car and drove into Sungei Patani. He went to a Chinese restaurant where he and Hardy had eaten a couple of times. He asked for Arfad, the proprietor, and showed him the address. The proprietor took him outside into the shaded arcade and pointed across the street to a red roadster. That was Allison's car, he told Arjun. Everyone in town knew it by sight. She had gone to her hairdresser's and would be out in a few minutes. There she is. She was wearing a cheongsam of black silk with a slit that ran from her instep to her knee. Her hair framed her face like a polished helmet, its deep black sheen contrasting brightly with the soft glow of her skin. It was several weeks since Arjun had spoken to a woman, and a very long time since he had beheld such a strikingly attractive face. He removed his cap and began to turn it over in his hands. He was just about to cross over to introduce himself when the red car pulled away from the shop and disappeared down the road. Now the periodic disturbances of the mountainside did indeed become auguries of Allison's arrival. The rising of the birds from the canopy was a sure sign for Dinu to go hurrying down to the gap to look below, and often enough it really was Allison, dressed in one of the somber black dresses that she wore to the office. Knowing that he'd be there, she'd look up and wave, and even as she was crossing the stream she'd begin to unbutton her blouse and unfasten her belt. Her clothes would be gone by the time she stepped into the clearing, and he would be waiting with his shutter primed. It seemed that the hours he had spent attuning his eye to the mountainside had been an unconscious preparation for this for Allison. He would spend long stretches of time thinking of where to place her, against which wall or which part of the plinth. He'd imagine her seated upright, leaning against a lintel, one leg stretched straight in front of her and another bent back at the knee. In the gap between her legs he would glimpse a striation in the pitted surface of the laterite or a soft mound of moss, as visual echoes of her body's fissures and curves. But the materiality of her presence would quickly disarrange these carefully imagined schemes. Once her body was placed where he wanted it, something would prove to be not quite right. He would frown into his square canvas of ground glass and go back to kneel beside her, sinking his fingertips softly into the tensile firmness of her thighs, teasing out minute changes in the angles of her limbs. Coaxing her legs farther apart or closer together, he would run a finger through the triangular swell of her pubis, sometimes combing the curls down, sometimes raking them back. Framed within the unnatural clarity of his viewfinder, these details seemed to assume a monumental significance. Kneeling between her legs, he would wet his forefinger to draw a thin trail of moisture, a glistening hairline. She would laugh at the intense seriousness with which he executed these intimate caresses, only to go hurrying back to his camera. When the reel was done, she would stop him before he could load another. No, enough. Come here now. She would tug impatiently at his clothes, the shirt that was tucked carefully into his waistband, the undershirt beneath it. Why don't you just take these off when you come here, as I do? He would turn gruff. I can't, Allison, it's not my way. She would make him sit on the stone plinth and then peel away his shirt. Pushing him back, she would make him lie back upon the stone. He would shut his eyes and knot his fingers under his head while she knelt between his legs. When his head cleared, he would see her smiling at him like a lioness looking up from a kill, mouth glistening. The lines were as perfect as any that could be imagined, the horizontal planes of her forehead. Her eyebrows and her mouth perfectly balanced by the verticals of her black, straight hair and the translucent filaments that hung suspended from her lips. She would see, reflected in his eyes, exactly what he beheld. Laughing out loud, she would say, "No. This is a picture you'll never see anywhere but in your own head." Then afterwards, quickly but methodically, he would dress himself again, tucking his shirt carefully into his trousers, fastening his belt, kneeling to tie the laces of his canvas shoes. Why bother? She'd challenge him. You'll just have to take them off again. He'd answer seriously, unsmiling, Allison, I have to be dressed when I work. Sometimes she would grow bored with the length of sitting. Often she would talk to herself while he was adjusting his camera, throwing in words of Malay, Tamil and Chinese, reminiscing about her mother and father, thinking aloud about Timmy. Dinu, she cried one day in exasperation, I feel I have more of your attention when you're looking into your camera than when you're lying here with me. And what's wrong with that? I'm not just a thing for your camera to focus on. Sometimes it's as if you have no other interest in me but this. He saw that she was upset and he left his tripod to sit with her. I see more of you in this way than I would in any other, he said. If I were to talk to you for hours, I wouldn't know you better. I don't say this is better than talking. It's just my way of understanding. ... You mustn't think this is easy for me. I never do portraits, they frighten me, the intimacy. Being in someone's company that long, I've never wanted to do them. Nudes even less. These are my first and it's not easy. Should I be flattered? I don't know, but I feel my pictures have helped me know you. I think I know you better than I've ever known anyone. She laughed. Just because you've taken some pictures. Not just that, then, because this is the most intimate way that I can know anyone. Or anything. Are you saying you wouldn't have known me if it weren't for your camera? He looked down at his hands, frowning. I can tell you this, if I hadn't spent this time with you, here, taking pictures, I wouldn't be able to say with such certainty. What? That I'm in love with you. She sat up, startled, but before she could speak, Dinu continued. And I also know, what? That I want you to marry me, marry you. She rested her chin on her knees. What makes you think I'd want to marry someone who can only talk to me through a camera, don't you, then? I don't know, Dinu. She shook her head impatiently. Why marriage? Isn't this good enough? Marriage is what I want, not just this. Why spoil everything, Dinu? Because I want it. You don't know me, Dinu. She smiled at him, running a hand over the back of his head. I'm not like you. I'm willful, I'm spoiled. Timmy used to call me wayward. You'd hate me in a week if you were married to me. I think that's for me to judge. And what would we be marrying for? Timmy isn't here and nor are my parents. You've seen how unwell my grandfather is, but what if? He leant over to place a hand on her belly. What if there's a child? She shrugged. We'll see then. For now, let's just be content with what we have. Without a single word being said on the subject, Dinu understood, soon after the time of their first meeting, that between himself and Ilongo there existed some sort of connection, a link that was known to Ilongo but of which he himself was unaware. This understanding arose gradually, out of their conversations, nurtured by a pattern of questions and occasional oblique asides, by Ilongo's curiosity about the Raha house in Rangoon, by his interest in family photographs, by the manner in which his references to your father slowly metamorphosed so that the pronoun disappeared. Dinu understood that he was being prepared, that when Ilongo judged it right he would let him know about whatever it was that lay between them. This awareness evoked strangely little curiosity in Dinu, and this was not merely because his attention was wholly claimed by Allison. It was also because of Ilongo himself, because there was something about him that was so transparently trustworthy that it caused Dinu no anxiety to concede to him his superior knowledge. Except for Allison, Dinu saw more of Ilongo than of anyone else at Morningside. He was dependent on him for many small things, posting letters, cashing checks, borrowing bicycles. When he decided to set up his own darkroom, it was Ilongo who helped him find second-hand equipment in Penang. One Sunday, Dinu accompanied Ilongo on his weekly trip to Sungai Petani with Saya John. They visited Arfat's restaurant, where Saya John handed over an envelope, as always. "I do it for my wife," he told Dinu. "She was hacked, on both sides. She always said that I was hacked too, except that no one could tell for sure, since I never knew my parents." Afterwards, Dinu and Ilongo drove Saya John to the Church of Christ the King on the outskirts of town. The church was bright and cheerful looking, with a soaring whitewashed steeple and a facade that was ornamented with polished wooden rails. Under the shade of a flowering tree, a colorfully dressed congregation had gathered. A white-robed Irish priest led Saya John away, clapping him on the back. "Mr. Martins. And how are you today?" Dinu and Ilongo went to the morning show at the cinema and saw Edward G. Robinson in I Am the Law. On the way back, after collecting Saya John, they stopped at Ilongo's mother's house for a bowl of noodles. Ilongo's mother was nearsighted and prematurely bent. When Ilongo introduced him, Dinu could tell that she already knew exactly who he was. She asked him to come closer and touched his face with fingers that were cracked and closed. She said in Hindustani, "My Ilongo looks much more like your father than you do." In some region of his consciousness, Dinu understood exactly what she was saying, but he responded to her words as though to a pleasantry. "Yes. That's true. I can see the resemblance." Apart from this one charged moment, the visit went well. Saya John seemed unusually alert, almost his old self. They all ate several helpings of noodles, and at the end of the meal, Ilongo's mother served thick, milky tea in glass tumblers. When they left, they were all aware, in a manner that was not in the least uncomfortable, that a visit that had begun as a meeting between strangers had somehow changed, in tone and texture, to a family reunion. On the way back to the house, they sat three abreast in the truck, with Ilongo driving and Saya John in the middle. Ilongo looked visibly relieved, as though some sort of hurdle had been crossed. But Dinu found it hard to give shape to the thought that Ilongo might be his half-brother. A brother was what Neil was, a boundary to mark yourself off against. This was not what Ilongo was. If anything, Ilongo was an incarnation of his father, as he'd been in his youth, a far better man than the one whom he, Dinu, had known. There was some consolation in this. It was on this night that Dinu mentioned his suspicions to Allison for the first time. She'd slipped into his room after dinner, as she sometimes did after settling her grandfather in his bed. At midnight she woke to see Dinu sitting by the window, smoking a cigarette. "What's the matter, Dinu? I thought you were asleep." "Couldn't sleep." "Why not?" Dinu told her about his visit to Ilongo's mother and what she had said. Then he looked straight into her eyes and asked, "Tell me, Allison, am I just imagining all this, or is there something to it?" She shrugged and took a puff of his cigarette without answering the question. So he asked again, more insistently, "Is there any truth to this, Allison? You should tell me if you know." She said, "I don't know, Dinu. There were always rumors. But nobody's ever said anything directly, not to me anyway. You know how it is, people don't talk about these things. And you, do you believe these rumors?" "I didn't used to. But then grandfather said something that made me change my mind." "What?" "That your mother had asked him to look after Ilongo." "So she knows, my mother?" "I think so." He lit another cigarette in silence. Allison knelt beside him and looked into his face. "Are you upset? Angry?" He smiled, stroking her naked back. "No, I'm not upset. And no angrier than I've always been. That's the strange thing, really, knowing the kind of man my father is, it comes as no surprise. It just makes me want never to go back home." A few days later Allison sent up a letter that had just arrived. Dinu was working in his darkroom, and he broke off to look at the envelope. It was from Rangoon, from his father. Without another thought, he tore it up and went back to work. That evening, after dinner, Allison asked, "Dinu, did you get the letter?" He nodded. "It was from your father, wasn't it?" "I suppose so." "Didn't you read it?" "No. I tore it up." "Didn't you want to know what he was writing about?" "I know what he was writing about." "What?" "He wants to sell his share of Morningside." She paused and pushed her plate away. "Is that what you want too, Dinu?" "No," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to be here forever. I'm going to set up a studio in Sungai Patani and make a living from my camera. It's what I've always wanted to do, and this is as good a place as any to do it. Chapter 31. The night Ilongo brought Arjun to Morningside House, Dinu, Allison and Saya John were in the dining room, sitting at the long mahogany table. On the walls glowed the bamboo shelf sconces that Elsa had designed. The room was filled with a rich, warm light. Ilongo was smiling broadly in anticipation of Dinu's surprise. "Look who I've brought with me." Then Arjun walked through the door, dressed in uniform with his cap in his hands. His Sam Brown glistened in the golden glow of the bamboo sconces. "Arjun, hello." Arjun walked around the table and patted Dinu on the shoulder. "Nice to see you, old chap, but, Arjun." Dinu stood up. "What are you doing here? I'll tell you soon enough," Arjun said. "But won't you introduce me first?" "Oh yes. Of course." Dinu turned to Allison. "This is Arjun, Neil's brother-in-law, Manju's twin. I'm so glad you came." Allison leant over to Saya John and spoke softly into his ear. "Grandfather, this is Dinu's brother-in-law," she said. "He's posted at the army base in Sungai Patani." Now it was Arjun's turn to be surprised. "How did you know I was posted at Sungai Patani? I saw you in town the other day." "Really? I'm amazed that you noticed." "Of course I noticed." She threw back her head to laugh. "In Sungai Patani a stranger stands out." Dinu broke in. "You didn't say anything to me, Allison." "I just saw a man in a uniform." Allison laughed. "How was I to know he was your brother-in-law?" "I knew," Ilongo said. "I knew the moment I saw him." "He did." Arjun nodded. "I walked into the estate office to ask for Dinu. And before I'd even opened my mouth he said, 'Aren't you Mr. Neil's brother-in-law?' You could have knocked me over with a feather." I said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Mr. Dinu showed me a picture from your sister's wedding." "So I did." Dinu recalled that it was 2 years since he and Arjun had last met, in Calcutta. Arjun seemed to have grown in the meanwhile, or was it just that he had filled out his uniform? Even though Arjun had always been tall, Dinu could not remember ever feeling dwarfed in his presence as he did now. "Well," said Allison brightly, "you must have something to eat, both you and Ilongo." The table was spread with dozens of small, colorful china bowls. Most of them still had their contents intact. Arjun eyed the food with longing. "A real meal at last." "Why," said Allison, "don't they feed you at your base?" "They do their best, I suppose. There's plenty here for both of you," Allison said. "So sit down, Ilongo, you too. The cook's always complaining that we send the food back untouched." Ilongo shook his head. "I can't stay." "Are you sure?" "Yes. My mother will be waiting." Ilongo left and another place was laid at the table, next to Allison's. Arjun seated himself and Allison began to pile his plate with food. "We call this ayam limau purut, chicken with lime leaves and tamarind. And here's some prawn sambal with screwpine leaves, and these are belacan brinjals, and over there is some chinchilok with chilies, shrimps pickled in lime juice, and this here is fish steamed with ginger buds. What a feast! And this was just an everyday dinner. My mother was always very proud of her table," Allison said. "And now it's become a habit of the house." Arjun ate with gusto. "This food is wonderful. Your Aunt Uma loved it too. Do you remember, Dinu? That time?" "Yes I do." Dinu nodded. "I think I even have pictures." "I've never eaten anything like this," Arjun said. "What is it called?" "It's Nyania food," Allison said. "One of the world's last great secrets. My mother used to say." Suddenly Saya John spoke up, catching them all by surprise. "It's the flowers that make the difference." "The flowers, grandfather?" Saya John looked at Arjun with eyes that were fleetingly clear. "Yes, the flowers in the food. Bunga Kenton and Bunga Telang, ginger flowers and blue flowers. They're what give the food its taste." "That's what Elsa always says." A shadow passed over his face and his eyes grew cloudy again. He turned to Allison. "We must remember to send Matthew and Elsa a telegram," he said. "They should stop in Malacca on the way back." Allison rose quickly from her chair. "You must excuse us," she said to Arjun. "My grandfather is tired. I should take him up to bed." "Of course." Arjun stood up. Allison helped Saya John to his feet and led him slowly across the room. At the door, she turned to look back at Arjun. "It's nice to have a visitor who likes our food. The cook's always saying that Dinu doesn't eat at all. She'll be delighted you enjoyed her cooking. You must come again." "I will." Arjun grinned. "You can be sure of that." There was a warmth and lightness in Allison's voice that Dinu hadn't heard before. Watching her from his place at the table, he was conscious of a sudden rush of jealousy. "Well, old chap," said Arjun, in a booming, hearty voice, "did you know that you've got everyone worried at home?" "No." Dinu flinched. "And there's really no need to shout." It was a struggle to muster the self-control to go on talking to Arjun. "I'm sorry." Arjun laughed. "Didn't mean to put you out, I'm sure you didn't. I had a letter from Manju, you see, that's how I knew where to find you." "I see." She said they hadn't heard from you in a while. "Oh, what would you like me to tell them?" Dinu raised his head with great deliberation. "Nothing," he said flatly. "I'd like you to tell them nothing." Arjun raised an eyebrow. "Can I ask why? It's not very complicated." Dinu shrugged. "You see, ... my father sent me here because he wants to sell our share of Morningside, and now that I'm here, I've decided it wouldn't be a good idea. You've grown to like the place, I suppose. It's not just that." Dinu looked Arjun straight in the eye. "It's Allison." "Really? What do you mean?" "Well, you've met her." "Yes." Arjun nodded. "You probably know what I mean. I think you're trying to tell me something, Dinu." Arjun pushed his chair back from the table. "Let me guess, are you saying you've fallen for her?" He laughed. "Something like that, I see. And do you think she's keen on you too?" "I think so. Hasn't she told you so?" "Not in so many words." "Hope you're right, then." Arjun laughed again and the light sparkled on his perfect teeth. "I have to say I don't know if she's right for a chap like you, a woman like that." "It doesn't really matter, Arjun." Dinu tried to smile. "In my case it's something I have to believe." "And why is that?" "You see, I'm not like you, Arjun. It's never been easy for me to get on with people, especially women. If something went wrong, between me and Allison, that is, I don't know how I'd cope." "Dinu, am I right to think that you're warning me, telling me to stay away?" "Perhaps I am, I see." Arjun pushed his plate away. "There's really no need, you know." "Good." Dinu felt a smile returning to his face. "Well, that's out of the way then." Arjun looked at his watch and stood up. "Well, you've certainly made yourself clear. So perhaps I should be off." "You'll make my excuses to Allison?" "Yes. Of course." They went together to the front door. Arjun's Ford V8 staff car was parked outside, under the porch. Arjun opened the door and held out his hand. "It was nice to see you, Dinu," he said. Even if briefly, Dinu was suddenly ashamed of his lack of generosity. "I don't mean to send you away, Arjun," he said guiltily. "Please don't think that you're not welcome. You must come back. Soon. I'm sure Allison would like that. And you." "Yes. Me too." Arjun appraised this with a frown. "Are you sure?" "Yes, of course. You must. You must come back." "I will, then, if you don't mind, Dinu. It would be nice to get away from the base every now and again." "Why? Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly, but it's not always as pleasant as it might be." "Why, I don't know how to explain, Dinu. Ever since we've got to Malaya, nothing's been the same." Arjun's entry into their lives was like a turning of the seasons. He dropped by almost daily, often bringing Hardy or some other friends with him. Sungei Patani had now become the headquarters of the 11th Division. And Arjun had linked up with many old acquaintances and friends. In the evenings he would gather them together and drive up from the base in whatever vehicle was at hand, sometimes an Alvis staff car, sometimes a Ford V8, sometimes even a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Usually they came after nightfall, driving up with their headlights blazing, sounding triumphal flurries on their horns. "They're here." Allison would run down to the kitchen to warn the cook. It was evident that she enjoyed these visits. Dinu could tell that it delighted her to see the house filled with people again. She produced clothes that he did not know she possessed. Until then he'd seen her only in the plain dresses she wore to the office and an occasional silk cheongsam. Now richly colored, beautifully tailored clothes poured out of her closets, elegant hats and gowns that her mother had ordered from Paris in Morningside's heyday. Almost every evening the house echoed to the sound of parade ground voices and loud laughter. They seemed never to stop laughing, these young officers. The smallest joke would set them roaring, pounding each other on the back. They usually brought bottles of whiskey, gin or rum from their mess. Sometimes Kishan Singh came with them to serve them their drinks. They would sit out on the veranda, sipping stengas and gin slings. As if by magic, vast quantities of food would appear on the dining room table. Allison would lead them in and then Arjun would take over. showing his friends round the table, explaining the dishes in minute detail. Look over here, this is duck, it's cooked in sugarcane juice. You've never tasted anything like it. And here, see, these prawns. They're made with flowers, ginger buds, that's what gives them that amazing taste. Dinu would look on like a spectator at a circus. He knew that the part of host should have been his own to play. But with each of these evenings he could feel his presence in the house diminishing, shrinking. It didn't seem to matter whether Arjun came alone or was accompanied by a troop of his friends. He seemed to have a way of filling the house even when he was on his own. There was no denying that there was something magnetic about him, a self-confidence, a habit of command, an exuberant abundance of appetites. Dinu knew he could not hope to keep up with him. At the end of each meal, Arjun would crank up the gramophone and clear the rugs off the hardwood floors. He and his friends would take turns dancing with Alison. It was a revelation to Dinu to discover how well she danced, better than anyone he'd ever known, just as well as dancers in the movies, with flair and rhythm and an energy that seemed inexhaustible. Amongst the men, Arjun was the best dancer by far. At the end of each night, he would put on his favorite record, Tommy Dorsey's band playing I'm Getting Sentimental Over You. Everyone else would pull back to make space for them, and when the record came scratching to a stop, the room would fill with applause. At the end of these evenings, Alison seemed scarcely to remember that he, Dinu, still existed. Once in a while Arjun would announce that he had succeeded in scrounging some extra petrol from the pilot chappies at the airstrip. They would set out on an expedition, sometimes just the three of them, sometimes as a part of a much larger crowd. One such foray took them to the lodge that sat atop the summit of Gunung. A group of pilots had commandeered the place for a party. They were to be Arjun's guests. They went in a Ford V8 staff car. To get to the summit they had to circle around the mountain, driving past quiet kampongs with palm-shaded mosques. Children waved at them from rice fields, standing on tiptoe to reach above the grain-heavy stalks. It was a cloudy December day and there was a cool breeze blowing in from the sea. The road that led to the summit was not much better than a dirt track. It tagged back and forth across the slope, rising steeply. The mountainside was thickly forested and the track wound through dense patches of jungle. It was several degrees cooler than in the plain, and the sun was blocked by a constant, quick-moving blanket of cloud. At the top the vegetation ended abruptly and the lodge appeared. It looked a little like an English cottage, except that it was surrounded by a balcony that provided dramatic views of the coast and the surrounding plains. The balcony was crowded with servicemen in grey, blue, khaki and bottle green. Scattered among the uniforms were a few women dressed in brightly printed cottons. Somewhere inside the lodge a band was playing. Arjun and Alison went off into the lodge to dance and Dinu was left to himself. He walked round the balcony, past tables that were draped in flapping white clothes. The view of the plain was hindered by a mantle of clouds blowing in from the sea. But every so often the wind would tear the cloud cover apart, providing spectacular glimpses of the plain. He caught sight of Sungai Patani at the foot of the mountain, with hundreds of acres of rubber stretching away from it in all directions. In the distance, he spotted the craggy peaks of the island of Penang and the finger-like wharfs of the port of Butterworth. The north-south highway ran like a great stripe across the landscape, approaching from the southern end of the plain and disappearing towards the north, where the border lay. Along the west lay the Andaman Sea, alight with the bright colors of the sunset. On the next clear day, Dinu promised himself he would bring his cameras to the lodge. For the first time in his life, he regretted never having learned to drive. For this view alone, the effort would have been worthwhile. The next day Arjun was back at Morningside again at an unusual hour, at 11 in the morning. He was driving a motorcycle, a wasp-waisted, pigeon-breasted Harley-Davidson painted a dull, military green. It had a sidecar attached. Arjun drove up to the house from the plantation office with Alison sitting in the sidecar. Dinu was in his dark room when Arjun shouted up from the porch. "Dinu, come down here. I've got some news." Dinu went running downstairs. "Well," Arjun laughed, punching his shoulder. "You're an uncle, Dinu, and so am I. Manju's had a baby, a girl." "Oh. I'm glad. We're going to celebrate. Come with us." "Where are you going?" "Down to the sea," said Arjun. "Jump on." Behind me. Dinu glanced at Alison, who looked away. He felt his feet growing leaden. Over the last many days he had struggled to keep pace with the two of them, but he could not be what he was not. He did not want to be with her just so that his presence would weigh on her as a reminder, anything but that. I don't think you really want me with you, Dinu said quietly. They sounded a chorus of protests. Oh, Dinu, rubbish. Oh, come on, Dinu. Don't be an ass, Dinu turned on his heel. I have work to finish in the darkroom. You go ahead. You can tell me about it when you get back. He went back into the house and ran upstairs. He heard the coughing sound of the motorcycle's kickstarter and could not keep himself from looking down from a window. The Harley-Davidson was speeding down the drive, heading into the estate. He caught a glimpse of Allison's scarf, fluttering like a pennant. He went back into his darkroom and found that his eyes were smarting. In the past he'd always been able to count on the ambience of the darkroom for reassurance, its dim red glow had been an unfailing source of comfort. But now the light seemed too bright, unbearably so. He switched it off and sat crouched on the floor, hugging his knees. His instincts had been true from the start. He'd known that Arjun could not be trusted, nor Allison, not with him. Yet what could he have done? They were adults, and he had no real claim on either of them. In a while he touched his face and found that it was wet. He grew angry with himself. If there was any tenet on which he'd wanted to build his life, it was that of never giving in to self-pity. That was a road that would not end, he knew, once he had started down it. He rose to his feet and walked around the room in the darkness, trying to recall its exact size and layout as well as the placement of every bit of furniture and every object. He counted his paces, and every time he touched a wall or bumped against something, he started over again. He came to a decision. He would leave. It was clear that Allison had lost interest in him and there was nothing to be gained from remaining at Morningside. He would pack his things and spend the night at Ilongo's mother's house. Tomorrow he would go to Penang to wait for a steamer that would take him back to Rangoon. The motorcycle headed due west, down a road that dwindled into a fraying ribbon of tarmac fringed by dust and sand. They drove through a small town with a blue domed mosque, and then the sea appeared in front of them, sparkling blue. Waves were climbing gently up a long shelf of sand. The road turned left and they stayed on it, driving parallel to the beach. They came to a small hamlet and the road ended. The marketplace smelt of salt water and drying fish. Allison asked, "Should we leave the motorcycle here?" "No," Arjun laughed. "We don't have to. We can take it with us. This Harley can go anywhere." The villagers gathered to stare as they drove through the marketplace, slipping through the gaps between the shacks. The motorcycle whined as it climbed over the dune that separated the hamlet from the sea. The sand was blindingly white in the noonday sun. Arjun kept to the edge of the beach, where the ground was held together by a thin carpet of weeds. He drove slowly, dodging between the wind-blown trunks of coconut palms. They left the village far behind and came to a cove that was sheltered by screw pines. The beach consisted of a thin white fingernail of sand. At the mouth of the cove, no more than 100 yards from the shore, there was a tiny island. It was thickly wooded, with green bushes and dwarf pines. "Let's stop here," said Allison. Arjun wheeled the motorcycle into a patch of shade and pulled it onto its kickstand. They took off their shoes and left them on the sand. Arjun rolled up his trouser cuffs and they ran across the burning sliver of beach, straight into the water. It was low tide and the sea was very calm, with gentle waves lapping at the shore. The water was so clear that it magnified the shifting patterns of the seafloor, giving them the appearance of colored mosaics. "Let's swim," said Arjun. "I didn't bring anything. It doesn't matter." Arjun began to unbutton his khaki shirt. "There's no one here." Allison was wearing a workaday cotton dress. She'd been holding it up, keeping the hem above the water. Now she let it drop. The water soaked quickly into the cotton, rising towards her waist. "Come on, Allison. We have the whole place to ourselves." Arjun's shirt tails were hanging loose, the buttons undone. "No," she laughed. "It's December. You have to respect our winter. It's not cold. Come on." He reached for her hand, his tongue flicking over the sparkling line of his teeth. She dug her toes into the sand. Through the clear water, she spotted the curved edge of a seashell buried between her feet. Reaching into the water, she dug it out. The shell was unexpectedly heavy, large enough to fill both her hands. "What is it?" said Arjun, looking over her shoulder. His khaki trousers were wet almost to the waist. "It's a nautilus," she said. The shell had an elliptical opening at one end, like a horn. The color inside was a rich mother of pearl, tinged with silver highlights. Its body was coiled into an almost perfectly circular mound. A spiral line ran along the mound, ending in a tiny protrusion not unlike a nipple. How do you know what it's called? Arjun asked. She could sense his presence behind her. He was looking over her at the shell, his chin resting lightly on her head. Dinu showed me a photograph of a shell like this one, she said. He thinks it's one of the greatest pictures ever made. His arms reached round her shoulders, encircling her body. His hands closed on the shell, his fingers dwarfing hers, his palms wet against the back of her hands. He ran his thumb along the edge of the mother of pearl mouth, over the line that encircled the swelling body, to the tiny nipple-like point that topped the mound. We should. Quote. She felt the touch of his breath blowing through her hair. We should take this back for Dinu, he said. His voice had gone hoarse. He let his arms drop and stepped away from her. Let's go and explore, he said, pointing in the direction of the island that lay at the mouth of the cove. I bet we could walk over. The water's very low, I don't want to get my dress wet. She laughed. You won't, he promised. If the water gets too high, I'll carry you on my back. He took hold of her hand and pulled her deeper into the water. The ground dipped until the water was at waist level. Then the sandy floor began to rise again, sloping up towards the island. Arjun began to move faster, pulling her with him. They were running when they reached the shore. They raced across the sun-baked fringe of sand into the shaded interior of the island. Allison fell on her back on the soft, sandy earth and looked up at the sky. They were encircled by bushy screw pines, screened from the shore. Arjun threw himself down beside her, on his stomach. She was still holding the shell and he prized it free of her grip. He laid it on her chest and ran his finger along the shell's spiral edge, cupping its body with his palm. It's so beautiful, he said. She saw how badly he wanted her. There was something irresistible about the insistency of his desire. When his hand slipped off the shell onto her body, she made no effort to stop him. From that moment on, when it was already too late, everything changed. It was as though he wasn't really there and nor was she, as though their bodies had been impelled more by a sense of inevitability than by conscious volition, by an inebriation of images and suggestion, memories of pictures and songs and dances. It was as though they were both absent. Two strangers whose bodies were discharging a function. She thought of what it was like with Dinu, the intensity of his focus on the moment, the sense of time holding still. It was only against the contrast of this cohabiting of absences that she could apprehend the meaning of what it meant to be fully present, eye, mind and touch united in absolute oneness, each beheld by the other, each beholding. When Arjun rolled off her, she began to cry, pulling her dress down over her body, clasping her knees. He sat up in consternation. Allison, what's the matter? Why are you crying? She shook her head, her face buried between her knees. He persisted. Allison, I didn't mean. I thought you wanted. It's not your fault. I'm not blaming you. Only myself. For what? Allison, for what? She looked at him in disbelief. How can you look at me after this and ask me a question like that? What about Dinu, Allison? He laughed, reaching for her arm. Dinu doesn't need to know. Why tell him about this? She pushed his hand away. Please, she said. Please. Don't touch me. Then they heard a voice calling in the distance, just loud enough to carry over the lapping of the water. Sup? Arjun pulled on his wet uniform and stood up. He saw Kishan Singh standing on the beach. Behind him was a helmeted motorcyclist on a Harley-Davidson just like the one Arjun had driven up from the base. Kishan Singh was waving a piece of paper, snapping it urgently through the air. Sup, Allison, Arjun said, something's up. They've sent a messenger from the base. You go ahead, Allison said. All she could think of at that moment was of throwing herself into the water to wash off the feel of his touch. I'll follow in a minute. Arjun walked into the water and waded over to the beach. Kishan Singh was waiting at the water's edge, his eyes held Arjun's for an instant. There was something in them that made Arjun check his pace and look again. But now Kishan Singh had snapped to attention, his hand raised in a salute, his eyes fixed in an unseeing gaze. What is it, Kishan Singh? Kishan Singh handed him an envelope. Hardy Sub sent this. Arjun tore the envelope open and unfolded Hardy's note. He was still frowning at it when Allison stepped out of the water and walked up to him. What is it? She said. I have to get back, Arjun said. Right now. It looks as if something big is underway. You're leaving Sungei Patani, my battalion, that is, you're going away. Allison stared at him as though she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Yes. He glanced at her. And you're glad, aren't you? She walked off without answering and he followed her. When they were over the crest of the dune, out of Kishan Singh's sight, he turned her around with a sudden violence. "Alison," he said sharply, "you didn't answer me." She narrowed her eyes. "Don't take that tone with me, Arjun. I'm not your Batman. I asked you a question. What was it? Are you glad that I'm leaving?" "If you really want to know," she said flatly, "the answer is yes." "Why?" His voice was halting and confused. "You came here because you wanted to. I don't understand this. Why are you so angry with me?" "I'm not." She shook her head. "I'm not angry at all. You're wrong about that. It wouldn't make sense to be angry with you, Arjun." "What the hell are you talking about? Arjun, you're not in charge of what you do. You're a toy, a manufactured thing, a weapon in someone else's hands. Your mind doesn't inhabit your body. That's crap." Quote. He cut himself short. "The only reason you can get away with that," he said, "is because you're a woman." She saw that he was a hair's breadth away from hitting her, and this had the odd effect of making her suddenly sorry for him. And then she realized that she had always felt sorry for him, a little, and that was why she had come with him that morning to the beach. She saw that despite the largeness and authority of his presence, he was a man without resources. A man whose awareness of himself was very slight and very fragile. She saw that Dinu was much stronger and more resourceful, and she understood that that was why she'd been tempted to be cruel to him, that was why she had had to take the risk of losing him. The thought of this made her suddenly apprehensive. She walked quickly to the Harley-Davidson. "Come on," she said to Arjun. "Take me back to Morningside." The front. Chapter 3-2. It was early evening by the time the 1/1 Jats left Sungai Pattani. They drove out of their base in a convoy of trucks, heading northwards on the north-south highway. On reaching the town of Alosta, they were deposited at the railway station and told to await further instructions. The men settled down at one end of the platform, the officers commandeered the other. The station was the smallest and prettiest that Arjun had ever seen. It looked like a doll's house version of the railway stations he'd known in India. There was a single narrow platform under a low, red-tiled awning. Potted palms hung in clusters from the beams, and the wooden columns that lined the platform were wrapped in brightly colored bougainvillea bushes. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland had stayed on at divisional headquarters. And he arrived late. At midnight he called his officers together to brief them on the latest siege. There was to be a drastic change in tactics, he said. There were indications that the Japanese were about to enter the war. Their forces were believed to be preparing to attack Malaya from the north. In order to forestall this, a strike force was to thrust deep into Siam to secure the eastern seaboard. This was intended to be a preemptive attack to deny a Japanese invasion force the potential landing grounds of the coast. The 1/1 Jats were to play a key part in this operation. The battalion's orders were to hold itself in readiness to entrain at a half-hour's notice. At dawn they would move northwards with the objective of occupying a beachhead near the coastal town of Singora. Jot these down. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland read out a string of map references while the officers took notes. After the briefing, Arjun spread a map on the station floor under a naked light bulb, brushing away the insects and moths that came to settle on the surface. He could feel his index finger shaking in excitement as he followed the thin red line of the road that led to the beachhead. This was it. Then, the proof of all these years of training, the waiting was over at last. Arjun glanced at the flower-bedecked platform. It struck him that this was a very unlikely place from which to launch a major operation. It was hard to sleep. At about 3 a.m. Kishan Singh brought him a cup of tea in an enamel mug. Arjun took it gratefully, without asking where it had come from. Beside him Hardy was dozing peacefully in a long armchair with his turban tipped back. Arjun stood up and strolled down the platform, picking his way past the huddled figures of the men. He noticed a light in the station master's office and stepped in. The station master was a Goan Christian. He was fast asleep, lying sprawled at his desk. There was a radio on a shelf. Arjun stepped round the desk and turned on the radio. He began to fiddle idly with knobs. Presently, the crackling airwaves yielded a newsreader's voice. Heavy fighting near Kota Baharu. Kota Baharu was in eastern Malaya. Arjun knew of it because of a friend who was stationed there. It was a small, out-of-the-way coastal town. Arjun turned up the volume and listened again. Now the newsreader was talking of massive Japanese landings along the seaboard. He heard him mention Singora, the town they were meant to occupy the next day. Arjun turned and went sprinting down the platform to the waiting room where he had left the company. "Sir," The CO and Captain Pearson were dozing in armchairs. The balloon's up, sir. The Japs have landed. Impossible, Lieutenant. The Colorado sat up. It's on the radio, sir. Where? Arjun led them to the station master's room. Along the platform the men were stirring now, aware that something was underway. Arjun pushed the station master's door open. The man was awake, groggily rubbing his fists in his eyes. Arjun stepped around him and turned up the volume. The newsreader's voice filled the room. This was how they learned that their preemptive strike had itself been preempted by an operation of unprecedented scale involving synchronized attacks on targets thousands of miles apart, an air attack on Pearl Harbor and amphibious landings along the Malay Peninsula. Singora, the town that was to have been their objective, was one of the first to have been occupied. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Buckland gave his officers a polite smile. If my knowledge of the army is any guide, I would suggest that you make yourselves comfortable here. It may be a while before we hear anything from HQ. There was something very comforting about the note of irony in his voice. Listening to him, Arjun found it hard to imagine that anything could go seriously wrong. There was a large airfield at Alostar, and at first light a squadron of Blenheims took to the air. The 1/1 Jats cheered as the planes buzzed over the station. A couple of hours later, the Blenheims came circling back with empty fuel tanks. Within minutes of their return, a flight of Japanese planes came humming over the horizon. They attacked the airport in close formation, at the precise moment when the refueling Blenheims were at their most vulnerable. In a matter of minutes the planes were in flames. The timing of the raid was uncannily precise. There could be no doubt that the enemy had been tipped off by a spy or a local informer. Later in the day, Lieutenant Colonel Buckland drove over to the airfield with a few of his officers. A medical center had been hit and there was a powerful smell of chemicals. On the apron, the tar had liquefied around the Blenheims. In the distance there was a row of attap huts. These served as barracks for the Malay auxiliaries who guarded the airfield. The men were nowhere to be seen and Arjun was sent to look for them. He found their barracks in perfect order. The beds were all made and each had a kit bag hanging beside it. Rifles stood leaning against the wall in neat rows, exactly as regulations demanded. But the men were gone. It was evident that after going through all the daily motions of tidying their quarters, the troops had quietly deserted. Dinu had spent the night on a cot on the veranda of Ilongo's mother's house. He woke up early. Both Ilongo and his mother were still asleep. He looked at his watch. The train to Penang wasn't till midday, many long hours lay ahead. He stepped outside and looked up at the mountain. The light had begun to change, the forest seemed to be coming alive. It struck him that he had never photographed the Chundis at this time of morning. He spotted Ilongo's bicycle, standing inside a doorway. He decided to cycle up to the mountain with his cameras. He put his equipment together quickly and cycled faster than usual. When he got to the stream, he dispensed with his usual rituals. Instead he went straight up to the clearing and set up his tripod. He was changing a roll when the first raiders flew over Gunung Jare. At first he paid no attention, assuming that the planes were landing at the Sungai Patani airbase. But minutes later, when the forest began to reverberate to the sound of explosions, he knew that something was wrong. When the next flight of bombers came by, he looked more closely. The planes were flying quite low and there was no mistaking their markings. They were Japanese. Dinu's first thought was for Allison. He hadn't seen her since she'd left for the beach with Arjun, but he remembered that she had planned to go to Sungai Patani that day. She had told him this the day before. She had errands to run. It struck Dinu that she was probably still in town. He left his tripod standing where it was and hurried down to the bicycle. He went first to Morningside House, where the cook confirmed that Allison had left the house very early that morning in the Daytona. On his way out, Dinu stopped to check on Saya John. He found him dozing peacefully in an armchair on the veranda. Cycling down to the office, Dinu noticed that a large number of people had collected on the parade ground. On approaching, he saw that Ilongo was addressing the assembly, standing on a chair, speaking in Tamil. Dinu caught his eye and signaled to him to step aside for a quick word. "What's happening, Ilongo? Haven't you been listening to the radio?" "No, Japan's entered the war. The airstrip at Sungai Patani has been bombed." Dinu took a moment to absorb this. "Allison went to Sungai Patani this morning. He said, we have to go down there and see if she's alright. I can't go right now." Ilongo gestured at the people assembled on the parade ground. They're waiting. Why, what do they want? The managers of some of the neighboring estates have abandoned their offices and driven off to Singapore. Our people here are worried. They want to make sure they'll get paid. Quote. Breaking off to reach into his pocket, Ilongo pulled out a set of keys. Here, you go yourself. Take the truck. Dinu pushed the keys back. I don't drive. Then wait, I'll be done soon. Dinu watched from the balcony of the estate office while Ilongo addressed the assembly. The meeting seemed to last forever. It was noon by the time the crowd began to disperse. Shortly afterwards, Ilongo started up the truck, and they drove off in the direction of Sungai Petani. They soon ran into another crowd. The air raids had ended a good few hours before, but people were pouring down the road, heading away from town. Many were on foot. Several families had their belongings slung over their shoulders, tied up in sheets. A boy was pushing a bicycle with a huge radio strapped to the carrier. Two men were pulling an elderly woman behind them in a makeshift trolley. Nearer town, the roads were clogged with honking cars. Sitting stalled in the truck, Ilongo began to ask questions. Leaning out of the driver's window, he learned that the air raid had taken the town by surprise. There had been no alarms, no warning. Now everyone who had the option was heading into the countryside to wait out the trouble. They parked the truck behind a shop and walked into town. They checked all the places where Allison might conceivably have gone. The banks were empty and most of the shops had their shutters down. Allison's hairdresser was gone. Where could she be? She'll be all right, don't worry. On the way back to the estate, they took a road that led them past the perimeter of the airstrip. The apron was littered with smoking heaps of metal, but the runways were untouched. They came across an Indian, a caretaker, who told them that there was a rumor that the Japanese bombers had been guided in by a spy, a traitor from the British forces. An Indian? Dinu asked apprehensively. No, an Englishman. We saw him being led away under arrest. Dinu was both shocked and relieved. It was only when they were back at Ilongo's house that Dinu remembered that he'd been planning to leave for Penang. He decided to put off his departure for the time being. He couldn't leave without making sure that Allison was all right. He went up to Morningside and sat down to wait. By the time Allison's car came up the driveway, it was almost sunset. Dinu was at the door, waiting. The relief of seeing her unharmed had the effect of uncorking all the anxieties of the day. He began to shout as she stepped out of the roadster. Allison, where the hell have you been? You've been gone the whole damn day. She snapped back at him. And what about you? Where were you last night? I was at Ilongo's, he said defiantly. I'm going to leave. For Rangoon. She gave a hard little laugh. Good luck to you, then. Let's see how far you get. What do you mean? I was in Butterworth this morning. There's chaos on the roads. I don't think you're going to get very far. Butterworth. What were you doing in Butterworth? She raised an eyebrow and her voice went cold. It's none of your business. She brushed past him and went up the stairs to her bedroom. Dinu stood fuming in the porch for a few minutes and then followed her up the stairs. Allison. He knocked at the door, his voice contrite. I'm sorry. I was just worried. She opened the door, wearing a white satin slip. Before he could say any more, she threw her arms around him. Oh, Dinu. Allison. I was frantic. You've been gone all day, with the bombing. You shouldn't have worried. I was fine, nowhere near the bombs. They were hitting the port and I was on the other side of town. But why did you go there anyway? All the way to Butterworth. What for? She took his face between her hands and kissed him. I'll tell you later, she said. Let's not talk about it now. Let's just be glad we're together and we're both alright. Chapter 3:3 Several hours passed without the 1/1 Jats receiving any word from divisional headquarters. Just after nightfall, a convoy of trucks arrived to move them to another location. They could tell they were traveling north, but it was very dark and they could see nothing of the countryside. At dawn, Arjun discovered that they were encamped inside a rubber plantation. Beyond a few hundred yards, the greenery seemed to solidify into a circular, bark-striped wall. Between the canopy of green leaves above and the carpet of dead foliage underfoot, there seemed to be no direct light and no shadows. Sound appeared to travel and linger without revealing its point of origin. It was as though he had woken up to find himself inside an immense maze where the roof and the floor had been padded with cotton wool. At the morning's briefing, they learned that the battalion was now positioned near the township of Jitra, very close to the northernmost tip of the federated Malay states. Here the peninsula narrowed to a thin neck. forming a bridge between Malaya and Siam. Any army advancing from the north would have to squeeze through this gullet, and it was here that a southerly advance could best be throttled. The 1/1 Jats, along with several other battalions, had been concentrated along the north-south highway. It was along this road that the Japanese were expected to make their advance. Chance had thus thrust the 1/1 Jats into the first line of defense. Arjun was commanding his battalion's C company. They were positioned a few hundred yards to the left of the north-south highway. Hardy was with D company, on the far side of the road. They were flanked by the Leicestershire Regiment on one side and the 14th Punjab on the other. The first job was to dig trenches, but here again the terrain proved deceptive. The soft loamy soil was easy to dig into but hard to shore up. Groundwater leaked in at unpredictable depths. The wireless sets began to malfunction and the problem was traced to the environment. The placement of the trees was found to interfere with the reception of radio waves. Even runners could not be relied upon. Disoriented by the geometrical maze of the plantation, they kept losing their way. Then the rains broke. It dripped constantly, and this too reinforced the impression of being locked inside a padded cage. Looking up, the soldiers would see rain pouring down from the sky. But by the time the water reached them, the showers had slowed to a steady drizzle. The dripping would continue long after the rain had stopped. They would look up to find that the skies had cleared, yet down where they were the rain kept falling, hour after weary hour. It was as though the leafy canopy were a wet mattress, emptying slowly under its own weight. With the soil turning to mud, their jeeps and lorries began to slide out of control. The vehicles were found to have been equipped with sand-grip tires, intended for use in the deserts of North Africa. Orders were issued banning them from entering the plantation. Supplies now had to be carried in on foot. On the afternoon of the second day, Hardy came running over and dropped into the trench. Arjun could tell from his face that he was ripe with news. "What's happened?" "Just heard a rumor." "What?" "There was trouble with the 1st Hyderabad's at Kota Baharu." "What kind of trouble?" "After the first Jap attack there was a panic at the airstrip. The airmen were Australians and apparently they left in a hurry. The Hyderabad Shinkos wanted to pull out too, but the CO wouldn't let them. They mutinied, shooting a couple of officers. They've been disarmed and arrested. They're being sent to Penang as a labor force." Arjun surveyed his trench, looking uneasily at the faces of his men. "Better keep that to yourself, Hardy. Just thought I'd let you know." The battalion's headquarters were deep inside the plantation, well to the rear of Arjun's company. Late on the second day, signals engineers laid a telephone line. The first call was from Captain Pearson. 336, "Contact." "Nothing yet," said Arjun. The day had faded almost imperceptibly away, the gloom deepening slowly into a dripping, clammy darkness. At that very moment, the dark wall ahead was pierced by a red flash. "Sniper," said the Havaldar. "Down, sup, down." Arjun lunged face forward into the ankle-deep water at the bottom of the trench. There was another shot and then another. Arjun fumbled for the phone only to find that the line had gone dead. Now the flashes of gunfire began to range through the surrounding darkness. The shots sounded at irregular intervals, punctuated by the dull thud of mortars and the spitting of light machine guns. To the right, from the direction of Hardy's emplacement, there came the sound of a Bren gun. This brought only a moment's relief, for Arjun noted suddenly, with an odd sinking feeling in his belly, that the Bren was rattling on too long. It was as though the men were too panicked to remember the ordered bursts that Hardy had tried to drill into them during weapons training. Now the enemy snipers appeared to be on the move, pivoting freely around their position. As the hours passed, the trench began to seem more a trap than a shelter. There was a peculiar defenselessness about being pinned into a stationary position by a mobile adversary. When they returned fire, it was as though they were letting fly randomly, in the way that a chained animal circles at the end of its leash, snapping at an unseen tormentor. The dripping of the trees continued without interruption through the night. Soon after daybreak they saw a Japanese spotter plane circling overhead. A half hour later another plane flew by, dipping low over their lines. It left behind a trail of paper that fluttered slowly down from the sky, like a great flight of butterflies. Most of these sheets settled on the canopy above, but a few trickled through to the ground. Kishan Singh fetched some, handing one to Arjun and keeping a couple for himself. Arjun saw that it was a pamphlet, written in Hindustani and printed in both Devanagari and Arabic script. It was an appeal directed to Indian soldiers signed by one Amrik Singh of the Indian Independence League. The text began, "Brothers, ask yourselves what you are fighting for and why you are here. Do you really wish to sacrifice your lives for an empire that has kept your country in slavery for 200 years? Arjun heard Kishan Singh reading the pamphlet aloud to the others and the blood rushed to his head. He shouted, "Hand those to me." Crumpling the pamphlets, he buried them deep under his heel in the mud. "Anyone who's found with these," he said crisply, "will be up for court-martial." Minutes later, with a blast that was like a moving wall of sound, the Japanese heavy artillery opened up. The first shells went skimming over the tops of the trees, sending down showers of leaves and small branches. But then, slowly, the explosions began to move in their direction. The earth shook so violently as to send the water at the bottom of the trench shooting into their faces. Arjun saw a 50-foot rubber tree rising gracefully from the earth and jumping several feet into the air before somersaulting towards them. They flattened themselves at the bottom of the trench just in time to get out of its way. The bombardment continued without a break for hours. Manju was in a deep sleep when Neil shook her awake. She rolled over in a daze. It seemed as though weeks had gone by since she had last slept. Jaya was a colicky baby and often cried for hours. Nothing would stop her once she started. Even Woodward's gripe water had little effect, a tablespoonful would send her into a light doze, but an hour or two later she'd be up again, crying harder than ever. Manju glanced at Jaya's crib and saw that she was still asleep. She rubbed her eyes and turned away from Neil. She could not disguise her annoyance at being disturbed. "What is it?" she said. "Why did you wake me up? I thought you'd want to know." "What, the Japanese have entered the war?" "Oh." She still could not understand what this had to do with her being roused from her sleep. "They've invaded Malaya." Malaya. Now everything was suddenly clear. She sat up. "Arjun. Dinu. Is there any news?" "No." Neil shook his head. "Nothing directly. But the radio said something about the 11th Division being involved in the fighting." "Isn't that Arjun's division?" She'd had a letter from Arjun just last week. He hadn't said very much about himself, just that he was well and thinking of her. Mostly, he'd asked about Jaya and her own health. He'd also mentioned that he'd met Dinu and he was fine. Dolly had been glad to hear that. "Do you still have Arjun's letter?" Neil asked. "Yes." Manju jumped out of bed and went to fetch the letter. "Does it say anything about his division?" Neil said. The numeral 11 leapt at her almost at once from the folds of the page. "Yes," she said. "That's his division." She looked at her husband and her eyes filled with tears. Neil put his arm round her shoulders and held her tight. "There's no reason to worry," he said. "As far as I can make out, the 11th Division is headquartered very close to Morningside. Dinu will let us know what's going on." Then the baby woke up. Now, for the first time, Manju was grateful for Jaya's cantankerousness. Her ceaseless crying left her with no time to think of anything else. Later that evening they were paid a visit by an eminent member of the Indian community in Rangoon, a lawyer by the name of Sahibzada Badruddin Khan. It so happened that the whole family was at home when the visitor dropped by. Mr. Khan was worried and he had come to give them some news. He had attended a meeting of some of the city's most prominent Indians. They had decided to form a refugee evacuation committee. It was felt that in the event of a Japanese advance into Burma, the Indian population would be vulnerable on two fronts. They would be defenseless against hostile sections of the Burmese public and, what was more, as subjects of the British Empire, they would be treated as enemy aliens by the Japanese. Many members of the community had expressed fears of a coming catastrophe. The committee's intentions were to get as many Indians out of Burma as possible. Rajkumar was amazed to learn of these measures. He was in an optimistic mood despite the recent news. He had just discovered that a friend of his had secured a contract for a long stretch of the Burma-China road. He was now absolutely confident that he would be able to sell his stocks of timber at exactly the kind of price he had been hoping for. "What?" Rajkumar broke into a disbelieving laugh. "You mean your people are going to run away from Burma because the Japanese have invaded Malaya?" "Well, yes, people feel." "Nonsense, Khan." Rajkumar slapped his friend on the back. "You shouldn't be taken in by these scaremongers. Malaya's a long way from here. Still," said Mr. Khan, "there's nothing wrong with being prepared, especially where there are women and children involved." Rajkumar shrugged. "Well, Khan, you must do what you think best. But as for myself, I think this is a great opportunity. Mr. Khan raised an eyebrow. How so? There's no mystery to it, Khan. With America in the war, there'll be more money for defense preparations. Burma is crucial to the survival of the Chinese government in Chongqing. The north-south road will be their main supply line. I'm willing to bet that the road is going to be built faster than anyone ever expected. And if there's an attack, Rajkumar shrugged. It's a question of nerve, Khan. I can understand why you'd want to leave. But for us it would be too soon. I've spent a long time preparing for this and I am not going to leave now. Manju was hugely reassured by Rajkumar's words. It was a great comfort to know that she did not have to think about going anywhere right now. Coping with Jaya was hard enough at home, she could not begin to imagine what it would be like in less favorable circumstances. In the morning, a runner brought a message to Arjun's trench. It was from battalion headquarters. They were to fall back on the Asun line, a string of defensive fortifications along a river, a few miles down the road. When Arjun gave the order to move, there was a muted cheer. He felt like joining in himself. Anything would be better than staying pinned in that trench. They made their way through the plantation in good order, but when they reached the road it became clear that the withdrawal was turning quickly into a headlong retreat. The men began to show signs of apprehension as truck after truck passed them by, packed with troops from other units. Arjun stayed with them long enough to see them into a truck and then he jumped into a jeep with Hardy. "Yaar, did you hear?" Hardy said under his breath. "What, the Japs have sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse?" "Impossible." Arjun looked at him in disbelief. These were two of the most powerful battleships ever made, the pride of the British Navy. "It can't be true." "It is true. I ran into Kumar, he told me." Suddenly a gleeful grin lit up his face. "I can't wait to tell Pearson. I want to see the look on that bastard's face." "Hardy," Arjun shouted, "have you gone mad? Why, have you forgotten that those ships were here to defend us? We're all on the same side, Hardy. A Jap bullet can't pick between you and Pearson." Hardy gave him a startled glance, and for a moment they looked at each other in mutual bewilderment. "You're right," said Hardy. "Of course. But you know, let's drop it," Arjun said quickly. When they reached the Asun River, the Japanese artillery fell unaccountably silent. Grateful for the respite, the 1/1 Jats took up positions beside the road, with their backs to the river. At this point, the north-south highway ran along a raised embankment, with thick stands of rubber on either side leading as far as the eye could see. The whole battalion was now concentrated in one place, positioned to defend the approaches to the river. Their vehicles were lined up off the road, along the slopes of the embankment. Arjun saw Hardy stepping out on the road and went to join him. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland was just a few paces away, at the battalion's temporary command post. He was with Captain Pearson, who was fumbling with the map case. Arjun stopped in the middle of the road to confer with Hardy. "Why do you think they've stopped shelling?" he said. "They seem to hold back at times," Hardy said. "It's hard to say why. You don't think it's because their own armor is moving up, do you?" Hardy scoffed at this. "What armor? None of us has any tanks, neither them nor us. This isn't tank country, that's what we were told." But somewhere in the distance there was a rumbling sound. They both spun about on their heels to look down the road. It was now almost sunset. The clouds had cleared briefly and the sky had turned bright scarlet. The highway ran straight for a couple of 100 yards before disappearing around a bend. Rubber trees rose above it on either side, almost coming together at the top to form an arch. The road was empty, there was nothing ahead. Hardy breathed a sigh of relief. "That gave me a fright." ... He raised his sleeve to his forehead. "I told you, this isn't tank country, that's the one thing we can be sure of, thank God." A moment later, with a great grinding of its metal treads, a tank turned the corner. On top of the turret, silhouetted against the sky, was a gunner's helmeted head. The turret swiveled in their direction until its gun became a single circular eye. Then the tank shuddered and its hollow eye turned a blazing red. At the bottom of the embankment, a petrol tank exploded and a half-ton truck did a little hop and burst into flames. For an instant Arjun stood his ground. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. A dim recollection of unfinished business urged him to turn and run back down the road to his company, to rally them into throwing up the wall of fire that the CO had talked about at the last briefing. But the CO had said categorically that there would be no tanks, and anyway, the CO was gone now, rolling down the side of the embankment along with Captain Pearson. On both sides of the highway, men were scattering into the plantation, running for cover. "Run, Arjun!" The voice was Hardy's, and it jolted him awake. "Run! Run!" He was stranded in the middle of the road like a startled deer, and the first tank was almost upon him, so close that he could see the eyes of the man in the turret, darkened by a thick pair of goggles. He jumped, throwing himself over the side of the embankment, lunging sidewise to clear the CO's burning jeep. Then he picked himself up and ran for the trees. Suddenly he was inside a long tunnel of greenery, his feet cushioned by a carpet of fallen leaves. The lucidity that had possessed him momentarily as he was standing in the middle of the road had vanished now. Its place was taken by a blind, unseeing urgency. It was quite possible that he was heading straight towards a nest of Japanese guns. But even if he had known that to be so, he would not have been able to stop himself. It was as though his breath and his blood had fused together to pound at his brain in unison, urging him on, pushing him to run in this direction. He ran several yards without stopping. Then, leaning against a tree trunk, he turned, panting, to look back. The trees fell into a sightline at the end of which a small stretch of road was clearly visible, enclosed in a circular frame as though he were looking through a telescope. He saw tank after tank rolling down the highway. By the sides of the embankment lay the vehicles of the 1/1 Jats. Some were upturned and some were on fire. The sight was beyond comprehension. He could find no way of explaining what had happened, even to himself. Was this what was meant by the phrase, "put to rout"? The swelter of fear and urgency and shame, this chaotic sensation of collapse in one's head, as though the scaffolding of responses implanted by years of training had buckled and fallen in. Arjun had a sudden aching vision of their battalion's headquarters in Saharanpur. He recalled the building they called the nursery, the long, low bungalow in which the officers' mess was housed. He thought of the heavy, gilt-framed paintings that hung on its walls, along with the mounted heads of buffalo and nilgai, the assegais, scimitars and feathered spears that his predecessors had brought back as trophies from Africa, Mesopotamia and Burma. He had learned to think of this as home and the battalion as his extended family, a clan that tied 1,000 men together in a pyramid of platoons and companies. How was it possible that the centuries-old structure could break like an eggshell at one sharp blow, and that, too, in this unlikeliest of battlefields, a forest planted by businessmen? Was the fault his own? Was it true, then, what the older Englishman said, that Indians would destroy the army if they became officers? This at least was beyond doubt. As a fighting unit, the 1/1 Jats no longer existed. Every man in the battalion would now have to fend for himself. He'd left his pack in the jeep, on the river. It hadn't occurred to him that he'd be running for his life within minutes of climbing out. All he had on him now was his .45 Webley, his water bottle and his belt with its small pack of odds and ends. He looked around. Where was Hardy? Where were the CO and Captain Pearson? He'd caught glimpses of them earlier, as he was running into the plantation. But now in the gathering gloom it was hard to tell what lay ahead. The Japanese infantry would almost certainly be mopping up behind their tanks, combing the plantations. It was possible that he was being watched even as he stood there, through any one of the hundreds of sightlines that converged on the precise spot on which he was standing. What was he to do now? Chapter 3-4 To drive to Gunung Jare was Alison's idea. She and Dinu left the house well before sunset in the Daytona, taking the road that circled around the mountain. The compound seemed deserted now, the daytime panic having yielded to a watchful quiet. In the markets there were hardly any people in sight. Alison was able to drive through at high speed. They made good time and turned onto the summit road while there was still plenty of light. When they began to climb, the sound of the car rose to a shrill, steady whine. It was twilight on the slopes because of the thick forest cover. Alison had to switch on her headlamps. The turns on the road were very sharp. They came to a bend that switched back on itself, rising upwards at a steep angle. Alison had to stop and reverse the car in order to make the turn. As they were coming out of the corner, they both looked up at the same time. The sky above the northern horizon seemed to be darkened by a stain, a cloud of tiny horizontal brushstrokes. Alison stopped dead, and they stared. Several moments passed before they realized that they were looking at a flight of planes heading directly towards them, from the north. They were facing the aircraft head-on, and in profile the planes seemed stationary, their advance signaled only by a gradual thickening of their outlines. Alison started the car again, and they went speeding up the road. The lodge loomed ahead in the gathering darkness. It was empty, deserted. They parked under the porch and walked up to the veranda that ran around the building. Tables were placed along its length, draped in white cloth, weighted down with heavy ashtrays. Plates had been laid out as though in expectation of a crowd of diners. They could feel the roar of the approaching bombers under their feet. In the vibrating planks of the wood floor, the planes were very close now, flying at low altitudes. As they stood watching, the flight suddenly separated into two, parting round the mountain like a stream flowing past a boulder. Banking steeply, one wing veered off towards the seaward slope of the mountain on a flight path set for Butterworth and Penang. The other wing headed for Sungai Petani, on the landward side. Allison reached for Dinu's hand and they began to walk along the balcony, making their way between the dining tables. The tablecloths were flapping in the breeze and the plates were covered with a thin film of dust. There were no clouds today. Far below, in the dimming twilight, the island of Penang appeared as a dark shoal afloat on the sea. To the southeast lay Sungai Petani, a small raft of habitation, marooned in an ocean of rubber trees. They could see roads and rail lines, glimmering in the last flicker of daylight. The landscape was like a map lying unfurled at their feet. The planes were losing height in preparation for their bombing runs. Sungai Petani was the nearest of the targets and it was the first to be hit. Bursts of flame appeared on the dark landscape, strung closely together in straight lines like rows of bright stitches on an inky fabric. They went around the veranda, picking at the tablecloths and running their fingers over the dust-filmed plates. They saw yet another cloud of planes approaching. On the seaward side, the bombers were diving low over the port of Fort Butterworth. Suddenly a great tower of orange flame shot up from the coast, reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast that followed was of such magnitude as to make itself felt all the way up the mountain. "Oh my God!" Allison threw herself on Dinu. "They've hit the oil tanks at Butterworth." She buried her face in Dinu's chest, snatching at his shirt, bunching up the cloth in her fists. "I drove past them, just that day." Dinu held her fast. "Allison, you still haven't told me why you went." She wiped her face on his shirt and pulled away from him. "Give me a cigarette." Dinu lit a cigarette and put it between her lips. "Well, I went to see a doctor." "Dinu, a doctor who doesn't know me? Why, I thought I might be pregnant. And I'm not." "And what if you had been pregnant, Allison?" Dinu said quietly. "Would you have wanted the child to be Arjun's?" "No." She threw her arms round him, and he could feel her sobbing into his shirt. "Dinu, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "About what?" "About everything, Dinu. About going away that day, with Arjun. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. If you only knew, Dinu." He silenced her by putting a finger over her lips. "I don't want to know, whatever happened. I don't want to know. It'll be better that way, for both of us. We don't need to talk about Arjun again." He was cut short by a flash of light, an explosion that illuminated the whole town of Sungai Petani. A series of lesser explosions followed, one after the other, like a string of fireworks. "The armory," Allison said. She lowered herself to her knees and stuck her head into a gap between the veranda's rails, holding onto the wooden bars with her fists. "They must have hit the armory." Dinu knelt beside her. "Allison," he said urgently, gripping her shoulders. "One thing's for sure. ... You have to go away. With Japan and America at war, you're in danger here. Your mother was American. Your brother still lives there. There's no telling what would happen if the Japanese managed to push through. You've got to get away, but where to? To Singapore. You'll be safe there. It's very well defended. We're too close to the border here. And you have to take your grandfather with you. You've got to leave." She shook her head violently. "I don't want to. I don't want to go." "Allison, you can't just think about yourself. You don't understand, Dinu. I'm a territorial animal. I'd rather take a few of them with me than give up what's mine." "Allison, listen to me." Dinu gripped her hands and shook them. "You have to do it. For your grandfather's sake, if not your own. And what about the estate? Ilongo will run it while you're away. You'll see. ... You can trust him, you know that. And you'll come with us, of course. Won't you?" "Allison, I should go back to Burma, my family. They might need me now, but you could come to Singapore with us first. You could probably get a ship there. It might even be easier." Dinu paused to think. "You may be right. Yes, I'll come." She reached for his hands. "I don't think I could bear to go without you. Especially now." "Why now?" She dug into his chest with her forehead. "Because I think I'm in love with you, Dinu or something like that at any rate. I didn't know it before. But I know it now. He pulled her closer. He did not care what had happened between her and Arjun. Nothing mattered but this, that she loved him and he loved her. Nothing else was of any account, not the planes, not the bombs. Nothing but this. This was what happiness was. He'd never known it before. This melting away, this exaltation, your gut spilling into your head. Filling your eyes, your mind transformed into your body instinct with the joy in your mind, the sensation of reality having met its end. Although the sunset was still a few minutes away, under the rubber trees it was already dusk. Arjun had heard many complaints about the terrain over the last few days, but it was only now that he became fully aware of the peculiar deceptiveness of his surroundings. He had a strange sense of having stepped into a picture that had been created with the express purpose of tricking the eye. At times the tunnels of foliage around him seemed still and empty, but moments later they appeared to be alive with movement. With every step, figures and shapes seemed to appear and disappear as rows of trees fell into and out of alignment. Every gracefully arched tree held the promise of cover, yet there was no point that did not intersect with a perfect line of fire. Arjun knew that many others had taken shelter in the plantation. At times he could sense their presence around him. Every now and again he'd hear whispers or the sound of footsteps echoing down the long, straight corridors that stretched away from him in every direction. Sometimes he'd hear a sound, somewhere close at hand. He'd spin around only to find that he'd stepped on a branch that was hidden under the carpet of dead leaves on the ground. It was impossible to distinguish form from shadow, movement from stillness. The real and the illusory seemed to have merged without seam. Just as twilight was turning to darkness, he heard the click of a safety catch. A whisper followed from somewhere nearby. "Kaun hai?" Who is it? The voice sounded familiar, but Arjun waited until he heard the whisper again. "Kaun?" This time he was certain. "Kishan Singh, sup?" Arjun took a couple of steps to his right and found himself face to face with his Batman. "How did you find me?" He acknowledged Kishan Singh's salute gravely, trying not to reveal the full extent of his relief. "Buckland Sub sent me," Kishan Singh said. "Where is he?" "Over there." It turned out that Kishan Singh had escaped into the plantation with a dozen others from the battalion. They'd succeeded in keeping together through the confusion that had followed the Japanese tank attack. Eventually they'd met up with Hardy as well as Lieutenant Colonel Buckland. Captain Pearson was still missing. They were now keeping watch to see if they could intercept anyone else. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland was sitting with his back against a tree trunk, his right arm cradled in an improvised sling. He acknowledged Arjun's salute with a nod and a slight gesture of his left hand. "Glad to have you back with us, Lieutenant." Arjun was elated to hear his wry voice again. He grinned. "Glad to see you too, sir. How bad's your arm?" "Just a graze, and it's been seen to. Fortunately we have a medical chap with us." Lieutenant Colonel Buckland gave Arjun a stiff-lipped smile. "Do sit down, Roy. No need to stand on ceremony now." "Thank you, sir." Arjun cleared a place for himself on the carpet of dead leaves. "You'll be glad to know that Hardy made it too," Lieutenant Colonel Buckland said. "I sent him off to forage for water. We are very short." "It happened so fast, sir." "Yes, it did rather, didn't it?" Lieutenant Colonel Buckland's voice faded away. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse, rasping, almost unrecognizable. "Tell me, Lieutenant," he said, "do you think I let the side down?" There was something about his tone that moved Arjun. "No, sir," he said vehemently. "There was nothing you could have done, sir. There's always something one could have done, but what could you have done, sir? We didn't have any air support. We didn't know about the tanks. It's not our fault, sir. If you're in command, it's always your fault." They were quiet again for a while. Presently the lieutenant colonel said, "Do you know what I've been thinking of, Roy?" "Sir." "The nursery in Saharanpur. I remember when it was built. My father was CO at the time, you know, and the 1/1 Jats was still called the Royal Battalion. We were away in Simla for the summer, and when we came back there it was the building that would come to be known as the nursery. There was a ceremony and a burra khana for the men. My mother cut a ribbon. I remember how proud I was to see our colors hanging there, moth holes and all. This was what got me started on military history. By the age of 10 I knew our battle honors by heart. I could have told you exactly how Jaimadar Abdul Qadir got his Victoria Cross. I was in my last year at school when the Royal Battalion went to the Somme. I came across something that Field Marshal Sir John French said in a speech and I cut it out. What did he say, sir? Something to the effect of, the Jats will never be forgotten on the Western Front. I see, sir. The Lieutenant Colonel's voice dropped to a whisper. And what do you think they'll say about what happened to us today, Roy? Arjun replied quietly, I think they'll say we did what we could under the circumstances. Will they? I can't help wondering. This was one of the finest units in one of the finest armies in the world. But today we were dispersed without being able to return fire. I will have to live with the knowledge of that for the rest of my life. You can't blame yourself, sir, really. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland was quiet again. In the silence that followed, Arjun became aware that it was raining and the canopy had begun to release its usual slow, unvarying drip. Sir, Hardy stepped suddenly out of the darkness, taking them by surprise. He handed the CO a green bottle. Water, sir. Where did you get it? There was a small pond, sir. We strained the water and used a few chlorine tablets. I think it's safe, sir. All right, then. Lieutenant Colonel Buckland's voice was businesslike again. You two had better get some rest. Tomorrow we'll head southeast. With any luck we'll be able to circle back towards our own lines. The rain continued without interruption, the moisture descending with the steady insistence they had all come to dread. Hardy commandeered a bedroll from one of the men, and he and Arjun sat leaning against a tree trunk, sitting at right angles to each other, keeping watch in the darkness. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly, and for once Arjun was grateful for his patties. But there was little he could do about his unprotected neck and face. He slapped at the insects and thought with longing of the mosquito cream he'd left behind at the Assoon River, tucked deep inside his pack. Sup? Arjun was startled by the sound of Kishan Singh's voice. Kishan Singh, sup? Kishan Singh slipped something into his hand and was gone before Arjun could say anything else. What is it? Hardy said. Arjun held his hand up to his nose. Why, he said, I do believe it's mosquito cream. He must have given me his own. Lucky bloody chutia, Hardy said mournfully. My Batman would happily see me eaten alive before he parted with his. Let me have some, there's a good chap. Sleep was impossible, there was nothing to do but to wait out the night. At times Hardy hummed under his breath, with Arjun trying to guess the tunes. Intermittently they talked in muted voices, catching up on the events of the last few hours. In a low whisper Hardy asked, what was Bucky saying to you back there? We were talking about what happened. What did he say? He was blaming himself, but there was nothing he could have done. That's not how he sees it. It was strange to listen to him, to hear him talking about it in such a personal way, as though he was responsible. I just hadn't thought of it like that. Well, how could you? Why couldn't I? To us it makes no difference really, does it? Of course it does. If it didn't, we wouldn't be sitting here in the rain. Yes, but think about it, Yaar Arjun, for example, what would have happened if we'd held our position on the Assoon? Do you think we, us Indians, do you think we would have been given the credit? Why not? Think of those newspapers in Singapore, the ones that were writing about all the brave young soldiers who'd come to defend their colony. Do you remember? Of course. Remember how all those brave young soldiers were always Australian or Canadian or British? Arjun nodded. Yes, it's as if we never existed. That's why what happened at Assoon doesn't matter, not to us anyway. Whether we'd held our position or not, it would have been the same. Yaar, I sometimes think of all the wars my father and grandfather fought in France, Africa, Burma. Does anyone ever say, the Indians won this war or that one? It would have been the same here. If there had been a victory, the credit for it would not have been ours. By the same logic, the blame for the defeat can't be ours either. It may not matter to others, Hardy, Arjun said, but it matters to us. Does it really, Arjun? I'll tell you what I felt when I was running into the plantation. Frankly, I was relieved, I was glad that it was over. And the men, I'll bet most of them felt exactly as I did. It was as if some kind of charade had come to an end. What charade, Hardy? There was nothing make-believe about those tanks. Hardy slapped at the mosquitoes that were buzzing around them. You know, Yaar Arjun, over these last few days, in the trenches at Jitra, I had an eerie feeling. It was strange to be sitting on one side of a battle line. Knowing that you had to fight and knowing at the same time that it wasn't really your fight, knowing that whether you won or lost, neither the blame nor the credit would be yours. knowing that you're risking everything to defend a way of life that pushes you to the sidelines. It's almost as if you're fighting against yourself. It's strange to be sitting in a trench, holding a gun and asking yourself, who is this weapon really aimed at? Am I being tricked into pointing it at myself? I can't say I felt the same way, Hardy. But ask yourself, Arjun, what does it mean for you and me to be in this army? You're always talking about soldiering as being just a job. But you know, yaar, it isn't just a job, it's when you're sitting in a trench that you realize that there's something very primitive about what we do. In the everyday world, when would you ever stand up and say, I'm going to risk my life for this? As a human being, it's something you can only do if you know why you're doing it. But when I was sitting in that trench, it was as if my heart and my hand had no connection, each seemed to belong to a different person. It was as if I wasn't really a human being, just a tool, an instrument. This is what I ask myself, Arjun, in what way do I become human again? How do I connect what I do with what I want? In my heart, Hardy, it doesn't do any good to think like that. They heard Lieutenant Colonel Buckland's voice somewhere nearby. Not so much talk, please. Arjun cut himself short.